Chapter 1: Graphite Under the Fingernails. The first time they brought her one of the drawings, Mara Ellison spent a full minute looking at nothing but the edges. Not the face that had already been on the evening news. Not the delicate shadow at the corner of a mouth she knew from photographs would never move again. Just the edges, deckled, soft, the slight bite of a hand-torn sheet. Someone had separated this page from its parent with care. Someone had loved the paper before they loved the person. Detective Jonah Park stood on the other side of her drafting table, with his hands in the way men hold them when the room contains both art and evidence. "You're going to tell me this is nothing," he said, which was the tone he used when he already knew it wasn't. Mara pinched up a corner with fingernails still blackened by charcoal. She never quite surrendered. The rag felt warm from its tube. The smell, fixative, graphite, a sweetness that came from good cotton, arrived late and hooked itself to a memory she did not trust. "It's not a print," she said. "See the tooth?" He used a hard lead for the hatch. 2H, maybe 4H where he wanted the bones under the skin. "There's pressure shine here." He leaned too much in the clavicle. She tilted the page to catch a slice of skylight from the studio window and showed the detective the faint metallic slip where graphite turns to mirror. No mass production. Someone stood over this and made decisions for hours. Park nodded once and let the corner of his mouth admit respect without becoming admiration. It was taped to a mail slot on Ashland. Names spelled right, little note on a museum brochure. For the record, the timestamp on the brochure is 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, she repeated, but not because she hadn't heard. Because we make words obey, by saying them again, the way you teach a dog to sit. The face in the drawing belonged to a woman whose mother had insisted to reporters that television had made her daughter's hair too shiny. Here, under the artist's hand, it was hair that understood light. Every flyaway captured with low, patient strokes, a weight you could feel. The eyes were not wide with fear. They were mid-blink. The nose had that slight bluntness that makes a face likable. The artist had drawn a crease at the corner of the mouth that none of the photos showed. Mara could hear the room the drawing had been made in, the way paper transmits a body leaning over it. "You're sure about the date?" she said without taking her gaze off the paper. "Brochure a gallery hands you at the door," Park said. "This one had a show on the 19th. Brochure batch stamped. The victim was found last night. Me puts the time at 48 hours. Then this was made before she died," Mara said. "Not just signed and dated. Made." She put her finger a centimeter above the skin between the eyebrows where the artist had broken a line very slightly, an artist's way of telling the viewer the skin was thin there. Nobody can fake stoppage marks. "See how the hatch lifts here?" He changed his mind and came back after the fixative. "It's not theater. It's process." Park took the pencil. She pushed toward him. Not to write, just to have something acceptable to hold. "So either he sketched her when she was alive," he said, "or he sketched her weeks before her death from a photograph that didn't exist yet. Or he sketched her from a photograph nobody else has," Mara said. "Which is a different crime than the one you get the press angry at." He grunted. That was as close as he came to agreeing with her in a room that smelled like turpentine and coffee grounds. "You still got your tools?" he asked, gesturing to the racks of sharpened pencils, the kneaded erasers like little moons, the stack of composite grids she hadn't had the heart to throw away when she left the bureau. "I told the captain you weren't in that line anymore." He made a sound I'm not repeating. "I still draw faces," she said. "I just prefer the living to be the ones who come sit." She looked up at him because he was the sort of man who didn't deserve to be addressed only in profile. "I'll map his hand." "You can do that." "I can tell you what he loves," she said, which is almost the same as telling you who he is. She laid the drawing under a sheet of acetate, weighted the corners with little brass ducks from a flea market she refused to regret, and took a fine-tip marker from a mug that had belonged to a man who didn't live here now. She traced the stroke directions without touching the graphite, cheek crosshatch slung at 20 degrees, countered by a 10-degree lift in the jaw. Eyebrow laid in with hairline strokes that started light and finished heavier. Hesitation at the start, confidence at the end. The nose was blocked in with an economy that made her achy with professional envy. Whoever he was, he spent time on cartilage. It's where lies like to sit. He draws from the outside in, she said. Most people start with the eyes because we're sentimental and pretend souls live there. He starts with the skull and works outward. See the faint scaffolding? He measured the cranium, then the planes of the face. He's building, not capturing. Architect, Park said. Or anatomist, she said. He reached into the portfolio tube and produced 2 more pages with the respect a man learns to have for anything creamy and valuable. Found last month, he said. We thought copycat. Chalked it up to ghouls who read news. Same paper, same hand. He titled them on the back, lower left, with a bone-dry pencil like he was writing a catalog. Morning Light with H. Head study, R. Names of the dead, initialed. The initials match. She flipped to the reverse. The handwriting was small, tidy, unromantic. People expect artists to have flourishes. The ones who do the real work have lab notes. Whoever this was, he kept his letters on a straight line without needing a guide. She could hear in it the voice of the person who had learned to be liked by teachers, not flattery, just compliance. What do you want first? She asked and realized as she said it, that she sounded like she had when the bureau sent her prints and photographs and someone else's bad day and expected her to draw a face out of statistical fog. She had left because all her faces looked guilty to her by the end. That, and because she woke with graphite under her nails and the memory of someone else's mother's mouth. We pulled a watermark, Park said. I figured you'd tell me whether it's worth anything. The lab circled a ghost in the corner. They have a report that says things like plant fiber signatures and batch number possibly from Rosslyn and Faye. I have a simpler request. Can you tell me where to buy it? Rosslyn and Faye, she said. They used to be on Prentice. Closed 3 years ago. Stock sold to a fellow who ran an atelier upstairs of a frame shop on Ferry. You don't buy this paper unless you think you deserve it. Meaning he's in the clubs where people are told they deserve things, he said. Meaning he likes the ritual, she said. And then, because she could feel the old pressure at the base of her skull that came when the beginning of a case tried to decide if it would own a season of her life, she put down the marker, picked up a soft blending stump, and tickled the air above the shading without touching it, the way gamblers hover over cards. She traced, not on the paper, but in the air, the invisible spiral she recognized in the way the cheek had been brought to life from bone. He breathes on the page, she said. He doesn't stomp it. He cares about the living more than the dead. He might not be the one who kills them. Park sucked in air like a man about to argue, and then thought better of it. Or he might. And this is his idea of foreplay. She capped the marker and slid the acetate back an inch to let the face breathe. Either way, she said, he's telling us he was there first. Gallery's your first stop? He asked. Paper's mine, she said. You. Go find who taught our man to draw cartilage like that. He grunted again, agreement this time. He gathered the portfolio tube, then, as if it hurt his hands to be empty, took the drawing by its edges when she slid it back to him and fitted it into its sleeve like a person tucking in a child and not a horror. At the door he paused. Do me a favor, he said. When you look at these, don't look at them alone. I'm never alone, she said wryly. I have the whole city's faces in here. She tapped her temple. They talk. Make them talk loud, he said, and left the studio to its smell of graphite and rain, and the woman with the needed eraser who had just realized she was going to the frame district for the first time in a year, whether or not the part of her life that had learned to walk away wanted to return. Chapter 2. The Watermark. Prentice Street had lost the sort of rent that keeps real artists fed, and gained the sort of rent that keeps people in jackets with good lining. The old Rosslyn and Faye storefront now sold handbags that looked like sketches of handbags. The windows wore a decal of a nib and a wreath and the year 1911 in type that lied the way logos do. The only true thing on the block was the smell that bled through from the alley, the vinegar of Fixer, the sweetness of sawdust, the metallic suggestion of old staples. Upstairs, over the empty frame shop, where 2 men were arguing about hinges the way country people argue about weather. The sign said atelier in letters that had been gold once and were now a responsible bronze. The caretaker had a face like a sympathetic clam. He let Mara in with the suspicion of a landlord who has learned the hard way that artists leave behind both paint and nouns. "We rent by the month," he said. "We don't keep portfolios. People keep their own messes." "Rosslyn and Fay paper," she said, holding up the drawing sleeve like a badge. "Rag sheets. Deckled edges. You sold your stock when they closed. To whom?" He squinted at the paper the way men squint when confronted with the proof that women take notes. "A professor with a French name," he said. "Wasn't French. Paid in cash like the old days. Set up the class upstairs. From the casket, he called it, which I didn't like." "Casket," she repeated, "because names are an engine. As in coffin." "As in drawer," he said. "Flat file. Those big shallow things that keep prints from kissing." He ran a life drawing group. Hands on Monday, heads on Wednesday, full on Friday if people were brave and the heat worked. Broad and plaster casts like the dead. That's what I meant. Casket. The drawers were full of noses. "Where is he now?" "Closed before winter," the caretaker said. Said the new class didn't want to look at a model more than 2 minutes at a time. TikToks. He moved across town to Prentice Square, then to the Arts Institute 4 nights a week. "I got an invoice somewhere." He fished in the drawer beneath the bell, where invoices go when they want to be found. He came up with a wrinkled half-page. Prentice Square Atelier, 18 by 24 rag, for dozen, 22 by 30 rag, 2 dozen, charcoal sticks, Nitram, 8 boxes, Connie 2B, 2H, fixative, casein. A signature that looked like S. Dillard. Mara copied it with the speed of a woman who had snatched details out of cars at night and out of mothers at kitchen tables. "He sold the good stuff," she said. "People liked that," the caretaker said. "Felt special. He spoke like a man in church. Made my renters think they were being forgiven for never having learned to draw hands like their sentences were always breaking in the same place." "You ever sit in?" "Hell no," he said. "I like my clothes." He let her into the studio because she had that way about her. The keys of a person who had been given many doors, the posture of someone who would not break anything she could not catalog. The room had been left empty twice over, first by the professor, then by the landlord's realism. Long windows on the north wall, the right kind, a floor that remembered casters, a chalkboard with the grid still ghosted, the thirds that teach even the arrogant how to count. She did not look for ghosts. She looked for habits. The thumbtack holes in the plaster, 18 inches apart at a height that made sense for standing subjects. The bruises on the floor where stools had been dragged out of the way of something heavy. The very faint film on the north window glass where someone with too much respect for older mediums had used fixative near a draft, and the spray had fogged a rectangle the size of a sheet of 22 by 30. She smiled despite herself. The room had been loved by someone who loved loving work. Beneath the windows, a flat file, the casket the caretaker had joked about, stood with 3 drawers ajar, as if the last person had left in a hurry and expected to return after lunch. She looked at the caretaker. He blushed, which surprised her. "I tried to sell the thing," he said. "Nobody wanted to carry it. You can't even get good interns to move things anymore." She opened the top drawer with 2 fingers, the way you touch the arm of an old chair you haven't asked permission to sit in yet. The bottom wore a watercolor stain a hand had tried and failed to sand out. A ghost of the letter R was impressed in the wood from stacks of paper left too long. The second drawer contained a smell of casein, and penciled away cedar contains a smell of its own history. The third held, at the back under a sheet of brown craft, a remnant. Not a drawing, but a corner torn off a sheet with a watermark that couldn't have been an accident. She held it to the light. The oval of R&F showed, crisp as a coin embedded in fabric, with a number beneath. 3142. Batch. Old companies stamped their own romance. The fiber glowed the way good rag does. She let the paper settle on her palm. "Can I borrow this?" she asked. "You can take the whole drawer if it helps," the caretaker said, and then colored, because he had offered too much and did not like feeling generous. "This is enough," she said. "It tells me where to go." "Where's that?" "Prentice Square," she said. "To ask us. Dillard why his drawers have numbers in the corners of my dead." She left a card because it was easier than reciting her number, and because cards are habits that reassure men like the caretaker that if they're going to be asked questions later, they will know what to call the person who asked them. Down on the sidewalk, she took her time putting on her scarf because the day was one of those the city gives you when it wants you to stay. Milky light, bare trees that make the air look like it has a skeleton, a cyclist swearing politely at a delivery truck, the wet iron smell of a train passing 2 neighborhoods away. Prentice Square was an old textile building folded into a new personality. Glass in the places where brick had given up, a logo that tried to look clever without being cruel. The directory in the lobby had the scattering of names that mean a city has decided to approve of itself. Massage, grant writing, artisanal something, an architect whose website would have photographs of chairs. S. Dillard. Atelier was lettered with the same restraint he had used in his titles. Floor 4. End of hall. Door cracked. Inside, the air was colder than it needed to be, a painter's preference for light with less heat. A row of easels stood like polite men at a funeral. On the wall, pinned with blue tape, were student heads and hands in varying degrees of despair. On a central table, a stack of paper, Rosalind and Faye, deckled toward the front like a smile. Class is full, a voice said gently. It belonged to a man who had learned how to sound apologetic and right at the same time. Early 40s. Jawline that had known being handsome and decided not to weaponize it. Nails clean. No graphite under them now, which either meant he taught more than he drew or that he washed like a man who had something to hide. His hair had gray in it that looked like he had earned it over drawings that fought him. "I'm not enrolling," Mara said. "I'm here about a hand that draws cartilage correctly." That earned her a flicker. Pleasure. Quickly shuddered. "Then you've come to the only place in this zip code where that topic pays my rent," he said. Sebastian Dillard. He didn't offer his hand. Artists keep their hands to themselves. The world is careless with them. "Mara Ellison," she said. Police consultant. It wasn't a lie. Not today. "Where did you get your paper?" He smiled like a man at a gallery opening who has 10 good answers for a question he has been asked 8 disingenuously better ways. "I inherited a small trove when neighbors found they had ambitions too large for their budgets," he said. "Why? Do you need a pad?" "I have cheap student stock for the uncommitted and absurd luxuries for the righteous." "I need to know whether you sold 12 sheets to someone 3 months ago," she said, and she laid the sleeve on his table with the drawing inside, because some doors open when you show a man an honest thing and watch what his face does. He did not look at the face first. He looked, like her, at the edge. His mouth did a thing, brief and barely visible, that happens when people realize they are about to be seen by someone they would not have chosen. He bent without touching the paper and inhaled. "R&F," he said. "Casein. Good fixative. This is, you shouldn't have brought this to my students." "Your students have seen worse," she said. "You run from the casket." He smiled again, this time without glamour. "The name survives bad gossip better than I do," he said. "Drawers and casts. I teach them to look before they praise. Sometimes 1 or 2 learn." "Do you catalog your sales?" she asked. She put the torn corner from the flat file on the table next to the drawing, the watermark shining like a coin in gutter water for a second, then dulling. "Batch number 3142. He glanced, then reached under the table for a leather-bound notebook that was too handsome for taxes. "Artists with bad taste by beautiful ledgers." He opened it to a page of small figures, dates, quantities, initials. Everything tidy. Everything that mattered left out. GP 1218 razy 24 MP 622 razy 30 ERA Portfolio EL Tuition Paper SD Consumables. He tapped the line 3 down and slid the book to her, so she would not have to commit to a crime to read it. HK 1218 razy 24 RF 3142. HK, she said. The initials curled differently than the others, as if a different hand had written them. "Who?" "Private student," he said. Paid cash. Nervous as a deer and twice as polite. Drew like a man who had spent his whole life knowing he had better eyes than people deserved. Left nothing but clean stools and compliments. You like your students tidy. I like my students present, he said. Tidy is a bonus. What did HK draw? She asked. He shrugged in a way that said heads, and in a way that said I am aware of my own performance. He was obsessed with the parts of the face people forget, he said. Nares, Ailey, Concha, Columella. He loved the vocabulary first. He learned the instrument after. He made noses like true north. He squinted at the drawing on her table. He did not draw like this. Meaning whoever made that is not my student, he said, and for the first time she heard something like envy and something like fear knit together. This hand is older, or younger, or more ruthless. You watched HK draw? He came after class. He paid for privacy. I looked sometimes because I enjoy watching someone remember a thing they knew at 8 and have been invited repeatedly to forget. Did he bring models?
No.
Photos. He closed his bag when I looked, Dillard said, and then smiled like a man who hates gossip and is still a citizen. He brought no photographs to me, which doesn't mean he did not own them. It means he loved the ritual of pretending he didn't need them. What did he look like? She asked finally, because that is a question witnesses try to make complicated, and it never is. Dillard's eyes slid a degree to the left the way they do when people try not to be caught looking into the word race.
Tall, he said.
Pale in the manner of indoor men. Hands too clean for my taste, but with a callus at the finger where pencils live when they aren't being theatrical. He wore a cap, as if he meant it to disappear him. He smiled. Everyone believes hats make them invisible. Hats make them hats.
Age.
35 with a 30-year-old arrogance, he said. Or 25 and already tired. Voice. Professor's child, he said. Stiffness softened by comedy that had practiced being not cruel. She jotted enough to give herself a scaffold, not enough to fool herself into thinking she had a face yet. If he comes back, I will be as helpful as the law allows without making me a policeman, he said. Which is to say, extremely helpful, and I will resent it in a charming way. HK, she said again, because saying names gives them weight. You see him, you call. I see him, I call, he repeated, and then, because men who enjoy theater enjoy leaving on a line even in the smallest rooms, he looked down at the drawing again and said, softly, whoever made that, Miss Ellison, didn't make a portrait. He made a schedule. On the stairs, she stopped 3 steps below the landing to write the sentence where she wouldn't forget it. Schedule. The word tasted like Jonah Park and the 9 o'clock news and a gallery brochure with a stamp you could trace to a coat closet. HK had bought a dozen sheets of very good paper. HK had drawn noses with the reverence of a catechism. HK had paid in cash. The man who wasn't HK had made a face that would be dead in 3 weeks and had left the drawing taped to a slot like a letter. On the sidewalk, her phone buzzed.
Park.
She didn't pick up right away. She needed the city to walk around her for 15 seconds without trying to talk to her. Then she swiped. Got another, he said without hello. Drawing. Delivered at the museum loading dock, wrapped in craft, tied with twine. Security signed for it thinking I had finally learned to send couriers like a gentleman. They brought it to the registrar. Registrar called me because it was not shoes. Subject.
A breath.
Don't be cute. Subject. She repeated, steady, because the word had to behave before they did.
You, he said.
It's you. Chapter 3. The Registrar's Package. It's you. Jonah Park didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The words did their work and then stayed in the room like another human breathing. Mara stood in the loading bay of the City Museum, where all art enters humbled. Under sodium lights, past cages with padlocks, across a floor painted battleship gray to remind beauty to wipe its feet. The registrar, Nora Laird, had set the package on a rolling cart the way people set babies down when they intend to count fingers and not cry. A rectangle of craft paper, the corners mitered with linen tape in a way only people who have mounted prints for a living bother to learn. The string was not hardware store twine. It was cotton tie. There was a penciled notation in the lower left, "Do not cut," in a hand that had learned to be severe with itself. Nora was one of those precise women museums hire, so the collection has someone to respect. Her hair, like her charts, was parted with conviction. "It was signed for by Eddie from facilities at 9:12, she said, tapping a clipboard. "Courier never made it to the dock security camera. I assume he knew where to park to avoid the lens. He came straight to the bay, said the registrar expected a delivery from the East Study, which is not a thing, and Eddie, being Eddie, took pity on the world."
"And you opened it," Mara said.
"I opened it in a separate room with gloves and a mask and the steel table we keep for unknowns," Nora said, with a quick flash of defensiveness that had more to do with her own standards than with any imagined criticism. "We are not idiots." Her gaze softened a millimeter. Then I called Detective Park. Park stepped back so Mara could come close. The paper was weighted at the corners with bean bags stitched out of denim. Nora cut the tie cord, not with a box cutter. Never in this room, but with a bone folder, worrying the knot until it gave back the way stubborn things yield to expertise. She lifted the craft with both hands and turned it aside. Mara saw herself made in graphite with a patience she recognized from other charts of bone and skin. Not a photograph's cruelty, a person's intent. The artist had not gone for the eyes first, he never did. He had built the skull, brought in cartilage, laid in the planes with a right-handed crosshatch that tightened near the alea of the nose as if he loved the words for the parts he was drawing. The mouth wasn't smiling or solemn. It was occupying itself the way mouths do, when the person owning them is listening and no longer tolerating being looked at. The hair was not flattered. He had left the flyaways where hair is honest. He had put the faint white scar under her brow where high school, a gym floor, and a poorly judged handspring had once made an argument with her face. No press photos had ever caught that. None of her students, God save her from students, had noticed it.
He had.
"Me," Park said, almost gently, and pointed with his chin because fingers did not belong on this paper. At the back, lower left, in that tidy catalog hand, he had written, "Head Study, Emmy, Morning Light." The paper underneath glowed faintly when Nora tilted it toward the ceiling fixture. RNF in an oval, below it, 3142. "Same batch," Mara said, because saying so kept her from doing something stupid, like finding an adjective. "Rosalind and Faye. Casein fixative." He drew it in morning light. "Morning at your place?"
Park asked.
Mara felt heat in the palms of her hands and cooling at the back of her neck, a bodily reminder that fear has its own climate. "Let me see the cornea," she said and leaned. Artists put things in eyes that they don't realize. They render reflections like a catechism. The pupil is a pooling of light. The iris is an elastic. The cornea, if you are cruel and patient, tells where the light came from. In hers, under the gentle dark hatch that suggested depth without show, there were two vertical rectangles and a sloping bar. Not a window, plural, windows. Not a skylight, a sash. And in the lower corner, almost a cue rather than a mark, a small, dark triangle hung from thread. She knew those rectangles. She knew that triangle. It was the string of paper cranes that hung from the sash cord over her drafting table, the one a student had folded for her, and she had pretended to be annoyed by until she didn't have to pretend anymore. He had drawn it small, perfectly, because he could not help himself. "He stood where my students sit," she said, her mouth dry. "He photographed me while I was working." Park's jaw logged the sentence, like a bouncer checking IDs. "We sweep your studio," he said, not with a question. "We ask your neighbors whether anyone has found a reason to start caring too much about light. We rewrite your routine until your shoes don't know you." "He likes ritual," Nora said softly, surprising them both. "Whoever rapped this likes doing things the way they were taught. No courier ever rapped like this. This is how registrars rap when they love drawings. Corners kissed, linen tape warmed with skin. Bone folder instead of a knife. Care, without sentiment." She glanced at the penciled note in the lower left, for the record. The same phrase from the brochure Mara had seen at her table. "He thinks he's not crude."
"He thinks he's right," Mara said.
She let her eyes lose the face and go to the paper's stress, the little stopping marks where the hatch changed direction, the faint scumble where a kneaded eraser had lifted a value and let the tooth show again. He had spared the fragile part of the paper the way you spare skin. No fat overwork. He had laid the fixative in light, correct passes. She could smell the milk of it, sweet and old-fashioned. He had leaned too hard once at the clavicle, his vice, it seemed. The graphite had mirrored. He had checked himself. "You said this batch number matches," Park said. "Our professor?" Dillard recorded a sale to HK. 12 sheets of 18 by 24, batch number 3142, Mara said. "Unless HK resold to someone older, meaner, and more patient than he is, we're looking at the same purchase. HK bought stock for ritual. Someone else made a schedule." "Schedule," Park repeated. "You're making your art words into my crime words, Ellison." "Welcome to the class," she said. "He has a list. He checks it with who he thinks he is." She looked at the verso again. Lower left, flush with the edge. Head study Emmy. The parentheses were not romantic. They were filing. A person who wrote metadata will tell you if they ever learn to stop. Nora drew a small breath, like someone deciding whether to be brave in front of officers.
"There's another thing," she said.
"Indentations." She gestured to a lab cart where a sheet of black mylar lay under a plate that showed the faint white letters of something that had been written on the paper when it was resting on top of another piece of paper with writing. "Electrostatic detection," she said. "We use it to pull writing from the felt of pages in diaries and letters. Eddie keeps one in conservation because donors are forever giving us journals they've loved into obliteration." Mara stepped to the cart. The mylar glowed with pale lines, the way a night street draws itself in winter. In the corner, over nothing but the memory of pressure, there were columns, not words, exactly. Initials. HR 14, LR 28,
JL 21.
ME 21. And down the right side, like a margin note, a slogan of a sort. In advance. Park made a small sound that admitted to fear and revenue. "Days." "Or numbers," Mara said, because she had learned to make all words behave before she allowed them to mean what the bad thing wanted. It could be catalog, it could be page, it could be a batch order, it could be. "It's days," Nora said gently, like a woman telling a mother the things she has already understood. "The museum calls donors every 3 weeks to remind them of events. I write lists that look like this." He wrote it the way we do when we think we're managing a calendar and not a person. Mara wanted to pry up the mylar and shake the letters until they gave her more. "Is there any more?" she asked. "There's a note you don't like," Nora said. She pointed to a sloped line in another corner where the pressure of the pencil had been enthusiastic. "Hold breath." And beneath it, smaller, like a rehearsal of shame, "Add mole, missed." Mara swallowed. She did have a faint fleck on her left cheek. People who stared at her face all day noticed. Normal humans never did. "He corrects himself," she said. "He's not guessing. He is updating." Park stayed steady because that was his job in rooms that were smaller or larger than they had any right to be. "We call HR LR JL," he said. "We widen the circle. We pull every camera between here and Ashland and the square. We ask your Dillard how he handles cash students with initials for names. And we sweep my studio," Mara said. She looked at her drawn mouth, the faint press at one corner where she held back sentences. "I sleep somewhere else for a while. Tonight you sleep in a place my people have had their hands all over," Park said. "I'll post someone on the door, so your dreams don't think they have to be heroes." Nora lifted the drawing with the care of a person who knows paper's temper and eased it into a sleeve. "Do not let it get out," she said. "We won't," Park said. "Not because it's evidence," she added. Her eyes met Mara's, even through the layer of personnel and pain. "Because it's you." Mara looked away then because you are not supposed to cry in loading docks, and also because if you do, you'll start to think you are the subject of the artist sentence, and that is the kind of vanity people die of. They left Nora with her linen tapes and her outraged standards. They drove to Mara's studio with the window down a crack because casein is sweet and the smell catches in your throat. The winter sun made long decisions across the sidewalks. At her building, a dog she recognized lifted its head from the second-floor sill and considered whether to warn anyone about anything. It did not. Dogs, like paper, have good instincts about dignities. The lock on Mara's door had the decency to be itself. Park opened it the way men do when they want rugs to respect them. The studio breathed in graphite and varnish and old coffee. The string of paper cranes hung from the sash, lower corner, exactly as in the drawing. The light fell across her drafting table at the right angle for morning, though it was evening now. The radiator clucked like a dog in dreams. Anything out of place?
Park asked low.
Mara made a slow turn the way she did when she lost a pencil, knowingly. The cheap brushes on the sink's edge. The wet rag nearly dry. The jar of sharpened pencils, like a bouquet. The jars of erasers. Kneaded, vinyl, a stump that had once had the fat of her thumb in it. The smell of someone else, no. Fixative, yes. But she had sprayed on Tuesday. She pulled the trash bag from under the table and found, down near the corner where she shoved paper towels when she was irritated with herself, a piece of linen tape, folded back on itself, cut with a bone folder. She held it up with 2 fingers. He wrapped in here, she said, or he unwrapped in here and repacked. He likes doing it right. Park put out a bag, and she slid the tape into it. Dust this place like you're trying to insult it, he told the tech on the phone. Send a unit to watch the door. No uniforms, no caps. Plain clothes with patience. Mara stepped to the drafting table and put her fingertips on the wood, then lifted them, because some temptations you honor by refusing to grow new ones. He stood here, she said. Park looked at the eye of the drawing again in his head. If he photographed you, he needed you to be center light. He didn't need to pose me, Mara said, and let herself have a shred of professional hatred. He knows how to appreciate without making noise. You want to move to a hotel? He asked. I want to move this table 6 inches, she said. I want to make the window a liar. And then, sure, I'll take your hotel. Just for a few days, he said, until we make your initials into actual people and tell them we intend for them to live to get irritated at us. At the elevator, Mara hesitated. HK, she said, Dillard student. If he's a front, he tells us something. If he's not, he tells us more. I've got a DMV pull on every HK in a 3-county radius, Park said. Dillard is on my list for 9 in the morning. I'm going to watch him look at your portrait again when he knows what it costs. They stepped into the hallway. A door opened 2 units down, and Mrs. Nguyen, who taught piano to children whose parents needed them to be someone else for 40 minutes a week, peeped her head out and then peeped it back in with the efficiency of a woman born between 2 wars. The smell of rice and anise came with the breath of her apartment and made Mara's stomach pine for things fixatives could not provide. In the lobby, Park pressed the sleepy man at the desk for the visitor log and got a shrug with a torn crossword under it. He didn't push. He had learned that men with torn crosswords will give you everything you need if you make them a cup of coffee with their own pot later. The hotel room had carpet, linen, a window that did not admit to knowing where it was, and a table that was trying to pretend to be wood. Mara stood where the window would have turned her face into something useful to someone else and closed the curtains with 2 long motions, left to right, right to left, until the fabric met itself and agreed. On the table, under the hotel's pen and card that welcomed her by last name in a font that did not deserve the job, she placed the copy of the electrostatic plate Nora had printed on plastic for her. ME 21. In advance. Hold breath. She looked at the handwriting and asked herself the question no one allows a forensic artist to ask aloud. What do you do when the face you have to draw is the face of the person who intends to draw yours? She sharpened a pencil because that was what she had always done when she needed a word to make a different shape. She turned off the lamp. She let the hotel hum be more interesting than her fear, and then the hum gave way to sleep to the dream of a drafting table under light that had no patience, and the word schedule written on a wall in dust where fingers have been. Chapter 4. From the Casket. Sebastian Dillard had the awkward courtesy of a man who fears becoming charming. He unlocked the studio at 9 on the minute and held the door for Detective Park and did not explain his decisions unless asked nicely and paid, in some currency not obvious, in the same breath. He wore a clean shirt that looked as if it had been put on with forethought and then apologized for with sleeves pushed up. Ellison told you? Park asked, not offering his hand. Dillard doesn't like hands. She showed me enough so that I would not pretend this is theater, Dillard said. I teach theater to children who are not ready to be good. This is not that. Park looked at the wall of student studies to keep his eyes off the man's mouth. HK, he said. Private student.
Cash. Tall. Pale.
Hands tidy. Professor's child. Dillard pulled his leather notebook and laid it open on the table with the same limp surrender he'd offered yesterday, the kind that says, I am not hiding anything in words because I know how to hide in posture if I need to. HK, 1218 by 24 RNF number 3142. The 3s and 1s were written by the same person as the other lines. The K leaned a bit more, as if he had written the letters while thinking about other things. Name? Initials, Dillard said. He liked to make me complicit by leaving me ignorant. You take copies of IDs?
Park asked.
When I rent the space, Dillard said. When I sell paper, I take cash like a sinner and spend it like a saint. Camera, Park said, indicating the corner where a black dome sat, dead and sculptural. Decoy, Dillard said. I can't afford the real thing, and when I could the last time I had a camera, students covered it with their jackets, so as not to have their posture recorded for posterity. The dome makes them behave like people who have posture. It's a miracle anyone learns to draw in a town with this much insecurity, Park said. Show me his seat. Dillard pointed not to an easel but to a stool near the window and the casket of the flat file. He didn't like to be surrounded, he said. He sat where he could see the door and the hinge. He liked the north light, but only afternoon when students had gone. He brought nothing, Park said. A bag I would have called a doctor's 10 years ago, Dillard said. Brown leather. Good edges. A bone folder in the side pocket like an old weapon. Pencils in a canvas roll that had seen better hands. He smelled like casein and winter. You watched him draw. I watched him draw cartilage correctly, he said. He went to a shelf and lifted down a plaster cast nose, Roman, nobly indifferent. He made this object into a habit. He would draw 5 of them in a row, each one from a different angle, none of them forgiving. Students fall in love with lips and eyes. People with intentions fall in love with noses because they are not sentimental. They are engineering. Park imagined a man drawing noses as foreplay. He did not let his face ask the question. You say, yesterday the hand in the portrait delivered to the museum is older, or more ruthless. Look, Dillard said, and laid a student page on the table. A good hand, not a great one. Spirited. The cartilage was present, the line changes in the right places, but a little clean, as if afraid to ruin anything. HK had not yet learned to dirty his paper. He kept his stroke like a good boy. The portrait Ellison brought me has cruelty in it. Necessary cruelty. I do not draw that way. I don't know if he does. You admire it, Park said. Dillard made a face that read yes, and I am permitted to have unwise tastes. I admire decisions, he said. The person who drew her makes thousands of them and refuses to apologize for any. Park pulled a clear folder from his coat. Inside, Prince Nora had run for them from the electrostatic plate. Not the drawing itself, just the lifted indentations like frost on glass. He slid it across to Dillard and watched Dillard not touch, then touch. Initials and numbers, Dillard said. If I tell you it is page numbers, it will be days. If I tell you it is days, you will accuse me of loving melodrama. I teach melodrama. I do not respect it. You know anybody else selling old Rosslyn and Fay?
Park asked.
Batch 30, 142. Dillard's mouth did the small lift again. Not smile, an admission that there were co-conspirators in the world, and he was often tempted to join them. 3 shops keep stashes and pretend they are gone, he said. Dieter's on 9th. The alley on Petticoat. An old woman on the Circle who only opens when she doesn't need your money. None will sell to boys who ask for canvas and spray paint. All will sell to a person who knows to ask for 2H and Connie and to say casein without flinching.
Park wrote them down.
Names build their own maps. HK, he said again, patient as a metronome. What do the letters feel like to you? Dillard looked at the air to the left of Park's ear and practiced seeing instead of looking. He sat with his knees close, which is how men sit when they're trying not to take up a room they can afford. He corrected with the side of his hand. Not the eraser, which is how you learn if you learned young and alone. He iced his language with words like render and value and plain, and then laughed at himself to ask me not to penalize him for having been born into money. That's a lot of biography from stool, Park said dryly. I am paid to be nosy, Dillard said. I make ratios out of posture. Park sighed because he enjoyed being given something and being irritated at enjoying it. He slid a card face down toward the artist. You see him, you call. You do not stage a reveal. You do not ask him about his bones. Those are not the bones I am interested in, Dillard said. Park let himself smile for exactly 1/2 second. If he paid cash from a bank down the block, I can find him, he said. If he paid with the kind of cash that smells like somebody else's drawer, that's a church problem and not mine. When Park left, Mara came up the back stairs so her feet could make the case for her, not her mouth. Dillard turned without surprise. People who live in light learn to keep it out of their faces with the sheer pressure of their attention. He drew me in my studio, she said, skipping greeting and 2 regretful jokes that would have been useful yesterday. The cornea shows my cranes. The window rectangles are mine. I told Detective Park he sat at that stool, Dillard said, not humbled. He liked to close the circle. I am so sorry, Miss Ellison. Not because he covets you, because you will be asked to be brave, and the brave exhaust me. I'm not brave, she said.
I'm trained.
He regarded her with the frank affection teachers reserve for people who might insult them better than they can themselves. That will do, he said. He lifted the plaster nose, turned it, put it down. You need to ask what he loves. He loves process, she said. He loves ritual. He loves wrapping drawings like archivists because it makes him feel like one. He loves casein and paper made when people said rag, without embarrassment. He loves cartilage. He loves noses. He loves starting from skull because starting from eyes makes him sentimental, and he thinks sentiment is a crime. Then he'll have been to a morgue, Dillard said, or read a text he shouldn't have enjoyed, or both. Mara took a breath like a correction. He wrote hold breath in the margin of a schedule he didn't intend to be found, she said. No one writes that unless they've been in a room where breath is rationed. Anatomy lab, Dillard offered. Or a place where someone teaches you how to make a person look like they were always a drawing, she said. A funeral prep room. A museum conservation lab. A medical photography suite. A place with drawers. Caskets, Dillard said. Mara turned the word with her tongue like a penny. Drawers, she said. Flat files. Morgue trays. Negative cabinets. Anywhere a life gets made into a flat thing and labeled. She left him with his noses and walked 4 blocks to the museum because her body needed to see Nora's linen tape again. Nora met her at the security door with a badge, and none of the false warmth bureaucracies sometimes attempt. What else lives in drawers? Mara asked, breath making fog in the loading bay. Everything we don't have walls for, Nora said. Prints, photographs, posters, maps. Objects that are too honest to be on display. We move them with our hands on the edges, and we call roll when they leave. What do you need, Ms. Ellison? People whose initials are HK, who worked within a mile of this dock within the last 3 years, Mara said. Men who would know how to fold linen tape into corners as if linen tape were a language. Men who would write for the record on craft paper because they correctly believe registers are holy. Nora did not say men, but her mouth moved as if the word had asked to be included. HK, she said. She walked them to a terminal that had nothing to do with the public and everything to do with the ways a museum cannot respect its work without remembering who does it. She typed. The names arrived like flattened promises. Harlan Keating, seasonal assistant in photographs, 2021. Hugh Kincaid, contract courier, 2022. Hector Klein, prep crew, part-time, summers only.
Henri Kim, interne, conservation, 2019-2020.
Photographs, Mara repeated. Conservation. She looked at the roster and felt luck pretend to be skill. Nora tapped Harlan Keating and brought up a file that had the polite half-details HR keeps for the living. A headshot that was all posture, chin that lied, eyes that hoped, hair that had not yet learned a conditioner that told the truth. A note, Left for graduate study, returned briefly as consultant, unpaid. An address on a street too expensive for truth. Keating's faculty recommended him to us. Nora said, face neutral in the way people go still when they remember being lied to by somebody whose handwriting was tidy. He organized negatives for photographs for 3 months. Brilliant, they told us. Too brittle for group work, I told them. He made a volunteer cry by correcting how she said gum bichromate. Where is he now?
Park asked.
He had come in behind them, plain clothes and the smell of paper coffee.
Now.
Nora said, here, sometimes, when photographs gets lost and needs to know which box under which shelf, he decided to store 100 glass plates labeled in the shorthand of gods. He likes to be the kind of helpful that makes gratitude attacks. Height,
Park said.
tall enough to be told to duck under doorways by old men, Nora said.
Pale.
Clean hands. A professor's son, if ever I met one. HK, Mara said softly. I'll have him here this afternoon, Park said. He'll show us his cartilage. Bring him to a room with good light and a table that humbles him, Nora said. Bring him to the study center. He won't be able to help himself. He'll correct your posture when you turn the print books. Meanwhile, Mara said, I need a favor. Nora blinked. We are at your service. I need your electrostatic apparatus, she said. I need to run it over the back of the drawing in raking light and lift every ghost he didn't mean to leave. Then I need to borrow a flat file drawer and build the schedule he thinks he's obeying. We don't let objects leave, Nora said reflexively, then looked at Mara's face and softened at the mouth like respect remembers itself. We bring the apparatus to you. You will hate my studio, Mara warned. We hate loving what we love, Nora said. It keeps us honest. That afternoon, in the study room where light lives like a benevolent tyrant, Harlan Keating introduced himself with a confidence he'd practiced on people who were told he was a prodigy. He shook Nora's hand not like a colleague, like a person eager to reassure a hostess she had set the right number of forks. He had a doctor's bag. It was brown, handsome, foolish. He placed it on the table with reverent hands. Mara, who was hidden behind a partition with a glass wall because Park had put her there like a Roman general behind a screen he thought too obvious to be a trap, saw the bone folder in the front pocket, the canvas roll of pencils, the roll of linen tape tucked beneath them, as if all the world were a package waiting to be prepared. Thank you for coming, Nora said, brisk, professional, uninterested in audition. We have a question about a loan. We were led to believe you packed the Bresson portfolio in March of 21. I did, Keating said, with the sweetness of a man who has just been given a chance to name the months he has slept with in public. I took the liberty of rehousing the smaller prints in 4-flap enclosures, which the board didn't want to spend money on until they saw how beautiful they are. Nora set a heavy book of albumin prints on the table and opened it in the middle to a spread with nothing on it. The page edges whispered. Before we open the case, tell me, how do you treat edges? She asked. He perked. We support them, he said. Fallen boards. Our fingers on the corners of the mats, not the paper. Never lift the window mat straight up. Slide. Let gravity be your co-curator.
Park let the man talk.
It is a kindness to let smart men adore their nouns before you ask them if they are murderers. It loosens their alibis, if they have any, and their spines, if they have them. Mara watched his hands. A callus on the side of his middle finger, where good pencils sit when someone learned early and much. No graphite under the nail today. Nails cut with a respect for half-moons. A faint chemical burn near the thumb pad you get from being sloppy with solvent exactly once. His eyes were not cruel. Cruelty is a clench. Cruelty is a pinch. His eyes were hungry and careful. He would cry, she thought, if you praised him too early. Do you draw? Park asked, too casually for good manners in any other room. Keating smiled with a dimple that made him look like the child of someone who had been told he was charming at 13.
I do, he said.
My work is poor compared to the master's, but I have been informed I can render cartilage correctly. Dillard's nose sat on the shelf of Mara's head, nodding. How do you feel about casein? Park asked, letting the fool's gold glitter. Keating did not blink. For drawings made to last, it's the only honest option, he said. Aerosols cheapen the room. Milk makes sense. And Rosalind and Fay paper? Nora asked. Keating smiled like a man at last allowed to say he belongs to a cult. I buy it whenever the old women let me. Batch 3142? Park asked, and let the numbers be their own bait. Keating looked delighted to be asked something hard. A little too soft for my taste, he said. I prefer 1820s. But 3142, if you go easy on the hatch, is... He stopped then because a man like Harlan Keating can smell when a room swaps gratitude for leverage. He looked at Nora, at Park, at the glass wall where light slanted just wrong. He did not look at the partition, which is how smart men tell you they've decided not to admit they've seen you. You think I've done something, he said. There was woundedness in it, practiced and not entirely false. What have I done, besides file for you for free, because your donors think money is something that makes rules and not something that buys labels? You bought 12 sheets of Rosalind and Fay rag, batch 3142, from Sebastian Dillard, Park said evenly. You draw noses. You write tidy. You like linen tape. You can enter the loading dock without the camera making a fuss out of your shoulders. Somebody is making portraits of victims before they die. One of those portraits is of a woman I intend to keep alive. You will now say everything your vanity has remembered about your movements for the last month. Keating's face went so still for 1 second that Mara heard the little tick a room makes when you put 2 temperatures in it too quickly. Then he smiled the way a child does when he has eaten the last cookie and knows the tell is on his upper lip. Detective, he said, you think I'm making art of dead people because you hope art will give you a schedule.
Park said nothing.
The silence did its work. I am many things, Keating said softly. Ambitious, yes. A martyr to materials, yes. Rude, when people who don't know what a gelatin silver print is call it a photograph, yes. I am not a murderer, and I am not a prophet. Whoever is doing this has a better hand than mine, and a worse heart. Names, Nora said, and it was the registrar's voice now, imperious and undistracted. Who else buys from Dillard? Who else is allowed near drawers? Keating listed them with resentful affection, assistants in photographs whose work ethic he admired and manners he did not, a retired framer who still came in to borrow the miter saw and scorn modern glue, a woman in conservation with a temper like varnish. He did not list himself until the end, which told Mara what she needed to know about his vanity. She filed him in the catalog under useful, innocent, dangerous in other contexts. Park told him to sit where he could be seen and texted someone whose hands were already walking to the museum. When he hung up, he looked at Mara through the partition and tilted his head a hair, no with a hope of yes later. Keating, to his credit, looked directly at the glass and said, MS. Ellison, I admire your mouth, which is a sentence a man who loves cartilage can say, without flirting. Whoever held you on paper understood your fatigue, and used it to flatter himself. I would like him to be asked to stop. Then help us catalog him, Mara said, stepping out from behind the partition because the theater had finished its act, and this was an archive. He writes for the record on packages. He wrote in advance on the back of a drawing and a list of initials and numbers. He corrects himself by writing ad mol, missed. Keating's face, astonishingly, didn't move to contempt. It moved to something like fellowship. He gives himself notes, he said. He is left alone enough to admit his own errors in a pencil that loves itself. He is a man who has never had to apologize to anyone who can fire him. He thought a beat. There's a private club on Circle who buys old paper and thinks it's a personality. They bring in speakers to tell them about contourline drawing. They think they're radical because they buy on the secondary market without asking provenance. If he is rapping like a registrar and drawing like a surgeon, he might be hanging his drawings in a room where men make each other immortal by speaking in paragraphs and draping linen over it. Nora?
Park asked.
I'll get you a list, Nora said, already walking. And Dillard? Mara asked. What does he know he didn't tell us because he has taste? Everything, Park said, which was the right answer. That night, back in her studio with ESDA on a folding table and Nora running the charge roller like church, Mara watched ghosts rise from the paper. The faintest indentations you get when graphite remembers what the hand above it asked it to be before it asked the page to hold it. More initials came, SD7, HK0, and a new line, the one that made her sit down because somebody else ought to remain upright, NL14. Nora Laird, she said. Nora's hands did not tremble. I've had my minute, she said. We don't owe him fear. He wants us to believe we owe him schedule, Mara said. She bent over the lifted list, as if breathing on it could make days shorter. Then we refuse him calendar. We give him a room with chairs and lights and a table he can't own. We bring him to it, and we make him behave. What room is that? Nora asked. Mara looked at the cranes in the window and the linen tape in a bag and saw, in the cornea of her own drawing, the exact size of a hand. The study center, she said. The place where drawers go to be seen. He won't be able to stay away. Park, who had been very quiet because men who had not yet learned to be frightened often get to be, he had learned, said, We'll need a day and a name. We have both, Mara said, pointing to the lifted plate. HK, a 0. He wrote himself out. He thinks he can erase it. Names, Park repeated, patient and mean in the way good men have to be when someone tries to make the world a schedule. Circle club list. Dieter's sales. The alleys. The old woman with the key. The Keating's calendar. And a chair, Nora said, more to herself than to them, with the devotion of a registrar assigning placement to an object she respects. At the long table, under the good light, with the drawer open. Chapter 5, The Study Center. The study center is the one room in the museum that never pretends to be a gallery. It is long and low and full of drawers, with light that treats paper like a sovereign and people like tolerated courtiers. Chairs that do not apologize. Tables with lips so thin they refuse to cast shadows on their subjects. Every movement here has a procedure, every procedure a reason. Nora Laird arranged the room the way registrars set tables. Not beautifully, correctly. 2 fallen boards at each station in case anyone forgot their wrists. Beanbag weights stitched out of denim for the corners. Gloves, cotton, and nitrile, because arguments about which protect paper best should be had in rooms without paper. A carafe of water no one would touch. The Yestier, electrostatic detection apparatus, on a rolling cart at the end of the line like a little altar with its own black cloth. You'll hate me for this, Nora said, setting a fresh sheet of 24 by 30 black mylar in its tray. I already do, Mara said, meaning I'm grateful. He won't resist the ritual. They had sent a dozen invitations to a study morning on cartilage and the architecture of the face, Nora's idea, a registrar's joke that kept the righteous out and let the people who actually show up in. They sent one to the private club on Circle because Park insisted it's morally correct to invite villains and boring not to. A sign at the front desk read drawer viewing, prints and photographs, study center in the polite typography museums use when they want the public to feel clever for reading. Park had built the rest with his usual, unfussy caution. 2 plainclothes in the reading chairs by the door, one with a pencil and the other with a book. A guard with a lap blanket and a thermos outside the loading dock. A runner posted in photographs whose resume included did not panic. He had offered to cancel the whole thing when the lifted plate put NL 14 in ghost white letters, but Nora had said precisely, "This is my room," and he had backed up half a step the way smart men do when they meet authority that doesn't need a badge. Sebastian Dillard came at the hour on the card because men who live by light respect clocks that work. He took a chair at the far end, lined up the edge of his notebook with the edge of the table, and kept his hands on his thighs as if he had come to his worst vice, admiration, prepared to behave. He had put on a jacket that decided to be decent instead of interesting. The plaster nose sat in his bag like an indulgence he intended not to commit in front of other adults. Harlan Keating arrived early because he was a man who believed in entrance via competence. He brought his doctor's bag and set it on the floor instead of the table, which won Nora 10% of his soul. When she handed him a foam wedge to support the spine of a folio that would otherwise drown under its own history, he did not gush. He nodded as if she had reminded him of his catechism. 3 others came from the circle. Two thoughtful women with the impatience good collections instill, and a man with a vocabulary that made Park write talks like money without having to spell the money part. Dieter from Ninth sent his assistant. The alley sent their suspicion. The old woman on the circle sent a message with no punctuation. We open when we open. Nora gave her lecture in the house style. 3 minutes on noses as engineering, 5 minutes on the way graphite shines when you press too hard at the clavicle, 10 seconds on the proper use of a bone folder when you want linen tape corners to behave. She never said murder. She said schedule once, and then made eye contact with Mara, and did not say it again. On the table in the middle, in a drawer held open by beanbags so gently you could pretend gravity had manners, lay the bait, a stack of clean Rosslyn and face sheets, batch stamped 3142, arranged with decals facing like smiles. Next to them, a smaller stack of cheap machine-made student stock because museums never humiliate guests who do not deserve it. A bone folder sat to one side, not a prop, a tool, unremarked, as if this were a place where such implements grew like mushrooms. Feel free to examine, Nora said, the way bureaucrats offer a kindness they cannot actually tolerate. If you find a question, ask the air and then me. People fell into the rituals they love. The circle man leaned over a map of noses Dillard had brought, made a performance of restraint, and scolded himself for thinking the Latin funny. The women compared hatches in student exercises and were terrible to them in exactly the way that transmits taste across generations. Harlan drifted toward the RNF, kept his hands tucked and his face soft, and earned himself a prize. Nora's okay. She slid the stack an inch toward him. He took the top sheet in both hands. He held it like a prayer. Mara watched from the corner by the Yes DA and did the worst part of surveillance. Nothing. She could have drawn everyone's wrists by now with her eyes shut. Park leaned on the end of the table and behaved like furniture, which is the highest discipline a detective can learn. He watched for a man who loved rapping as an end in itself. He didn't have to wait long. At 10:43, a person who hadn't been invited but had been permitted by habit drifted in with all the posture of someone who belongs to rooms because he visits them often enough. Mid-30s if you were fooled by easy groceries. Older if you counted the kind of damage that happens to men who make aesthetics a job.
Tall. Pale.
Hands clean. A cap on his head that thought how useful it was and made him look like a child who would prefer to be an object. He made a beeline for the open drawer without pretending to inspect the Rembrandt etching Nora had laid out as a decoy for exactly that purpose. H. Kincaid, he said to Nora when she turned the way good hosts turned toward the door. The name was right. The tone was wrong. Not declarative, presented, as if it ought to be on a register somewhere, and if it wasn't, the room would correct itself. Photography courier. I'm early for the West Stair pickup. Nora nodded the neutral curator's nod that means you will not be permitted to dominate this room because cartwheels make no claims here. We'll ring for you when the crate is staged, she said. Her eyes dipped. Bag, pocket, hands. Linen tape poked an indecent inch above his bag's edge. Bone folder. Canvas roll. Kincaid followed her gaze and smiled with the boldness of a man who believes self-awareness makes him harmless. May I? He asked, already sidestepping to the drawer with the RNF stacked the way undertakers step to their work. Handsomer than necessary, correcter than kind. Nora did not say no. She does not say no to people who might be here for legitimate reasons until she knows what verb they are about to be. Kincaid put his bag down beside the drawer as if he had been assigned this station for 10 years. He did not take a sheet. He turned the stack once, deckled to the back, then restored it, as if to remind the paper it could be rejected, and then accepted. He reached for the bone folder. He did not touch it. His hand hovered over it the way Del Sards had hovered over the plaster nose. Lovely, he said to no one. The good batch. Harlan Keating, across the table, did the worst possible thing for his own odds and the best for the room. He lit with recognition. Batch 3142, he said, delighted and doomed. Excellent for hatching if you don't overwork the tooth. Kincaid's mouth did that brief lift Mara had seen on Dillard. Pleasure admitted, then tidied. If you've bought any, you're a thief or a friend, he said. A student, Harlan said. We keep the drawers company. Kincaid touched the corner of the top sheet with the back of one clean, knuckled away men touch cheeks in paintings they cannot afford. He drew back, sniffed. The rag smelled like rag. He looked up, and his eyes, gray, too light to be useful, too steady to be safe, passed over Nora and landed where eyes land when they learn to scout peripheries, not faces. He marked exits. He marked corners. He marked the USDA cart without knowing its name and did not like it. Park said, conversational and mean, "Ever take Dillard's class?" "Once," Kincaid said. "Too many students. Too much looking." He smiled with a little damage in it. "I prefer the dead. They don't duck when they're bored." "You rap like a registrar," Nora said, "because there are shots you have to take when men are speaking prose in your room." She slipped the phrase at him like a collar. He took it like a dog that has been trained too well to show resistance. "I'm a courier," he said. "I have my vices." "Linen tape," she said softly. "The only decent adhesive that doesn't make paper lazy," he said. "May I sit?" He meant may I be permitted to perform in the chair closest to the drawer so I can lean in and breathe on the paper the way it wants me to, and no one here will stop me because I have just said a magic phrase. "Sit," Nora said. "Use your hands like they belong to somebody else." When his bag tipped a degree as he lowered, the canvas roll inside shifted. Pencils, Conti in 2H, a hard lead rare in rooms where sentiment is the drug of choice. The bone folder glinted. The linen tape made its small fabric noise. Mara could feel Park recognizing the same list of nouns she did and the same friction. Kincaid had the kit. He had the confidence. He had the loading dock. He had the habits. But the ruthless hand on the drawing, the one that had flattered her fatigue and not her features, hadn't shown itself here yet. Kincaid's fingers told a story. Yes, no graphite today. One solvent burn healed to a gloss, a callus where pencils live, but the little grace note that separates a good hand from the one that uses pressure like a confession wasn't present. He touched the paper like a man touching a dress he could not afford. He didn't touch it like a person touching an instrument he intended to play until it bled. "Mr. Kincaid," Nora said suddenly, as if she were bored of a play and had decided to play conductor. "Would you do me a courtesy? Trace the contour of the ailie on that cast." She pointed not to the Rembrandt decoy, but to the plaster nose Dillard had reluctantly extracted from his bag and laid on a foam cradle because suffering pleases him. She slid a piece of student stock toward him with a weighted corner. Just the outer line, 2 inches. Bone folder as if it were a pencil. Humor the registrar. Kincaid held the folder the way men hold knives when they are pretending they do not know what knives are for. He traced a line. It was good. Too careful. No cruelty. No pressure shine. He was performing honesty, and it probably wasn't his fault. That's what couriers are trained to do. "Thank you," Nora said, taking the student stock as if it were evidence and placing it in a sleeve that said, without saying, "We will look at this later when you aren't pretending we won't." She slid the R&F stack a half-inch away from him. A rebuke without an audience. Kincaid's eyes flicked to the USDA card again. He didn't like anything with a sheet you could write upon that recorded pressure you didn't mean to make. He stood politely. "I'll wait in the corridor," he said. "Call me when the stair crate is ready." "Do," Nora said. He left like smoke that hadn't decided to be fire. Park's plainclothes in the hall split and reformed around him like a school of fish that had just remembered the rules of the tank. Dillard exhaled, quiet, a man who had been minorly wrong and had enjoyed it less than he thought he would. Harlan remembered to close his bag and then forgot to remember to act like he hadn't been excited to see someone he now hated. Mara leaned to Park without moving her feet. "He raps," she said. "He smells like casein and winter. But that isn't our hand. Or it's our hand when it's behaving," Park said. "Either way, we keep him where the drawers are." The room returned, with relief, to the intelligence of paper. Nora set a folio of 19th century albumen prints on a cradle, and suddenly everyone remembered how to be reverent for the right things. There was a silver gelatin portrait of a child with a ribbon that made Harlan swallow hard in secret. There was a salt print whose corners ached. There were margins with pencil notes from long-dead catalogers who had tried to make their handwriting acceptable to God. Mara moved to the ESDA and slid a fresh mylar into the tray. She laid a sheet of clean student stock on top and weighted its corners. Beside it, not remarked upon, she placed a pencil, a bone folder, and a square of linen tape pre-cut to size. Then she did the thing that had made her good at her old job and terrible at being left alone. She left the room. Through the glass from the corridor, she watched how rooms behave when the person who intends to control them pretends not to. Kincaid stood at the end of the hall with his bag and his cap, staring at nothing, the way men stare at windows when windows won't have them. Park's plainclothes made a conversation out of a phone that wasn't on. Dillard flipped his notebook shut with a small sound of relief. Harlan, who cannot leave anything be, drifted toward the USDA cart because curiosity is a kind of prayer. Nora caught his wrist with 2 fingers. "Don't touch the black," she said, low, not unkind. "Only the paper." Harlan grinned, chastened. He took the pencil like a penitent and wrote, just to feel the drag, batch 3142 on the student stock, and then, with the affection of a man who likes to leave notes for himself, be kinder. Nora glanced at the USDA plate and did not look away quickly enough to hide her own affection. "I like you better than I mean to," she said. A shadow passed the glass. Kincaid had stepped back to the doorway. He looked at the cart and the plate and the pencil abandoned with a bone folder next to it and felt. Mara could read it through glass. Ache. Not to draw. To complete. To leave the ritual correct, not beautiful. He slid the cap off the pencil, wrote on the student stock for the record, and out of habit, because habits are what men have when they refuse to call something love, tore a square of linen tape off the stack and laid it over the corner to tell the future that somebody here knew what the past had asked of it. He left. Park let him go because there are nets to be drawn which require more line than you can afford in a morning. Nora brought the charge bar down over the plate and turned on the machine. The dust fell like confession. The words for the record came up white where graphite had pressed through student stock into the mylar. Beneath it, lighter, not Kincaid's pressure. 2 initials and a number, SD6. Dillard's chair did not move. His throat did. Mara's hand went flat on the glass the way the body does when it wants to touch without making a show of it. "He moved me up," Dillard said, a strange faith in me. "He has decided to be punctual." "Then we will be more so," Nora said crisply, because what else do you say when schedules threaten people with taste? "We will keep you in rooms with drawers. We will take your mail at the dock. We will teach you to duck." Park texted a thing that would make other men walk and then texted another thing, without words that meant, "No more inviting villains to exercise in our rooms unless we choose the exercises." He wrote Kincaid and underlined it once and wrote hand and underlined that twice. Mara took up her own pencil, the old one with the bit chewed near its ferrule, and drew a circle on the corner of the mylar around SD. 6. The circle made a different sound than the letters had. She did not enjoy it.
6 days, she said.
"We take them from him." "How?" Park asked, because he prefers verbs. "By refusing his calendar," she said. "By giving him ours." Chapter 6. A different kind of register. They built a calendar the way you build a case. You assign nouns to days. SD. Today became Dillard with a deputy on his elbow and an artist's indignation under his jacket. NL. 14 became Nora paired with a registrar from antiquities who knew how to make her eat lunch and an assistant in photographs who had inherited not patience, but its posture. ME. 21. Mara, if you believed his plate. Mara, if you didn't. Made herself the sort of appointment other people keep. Hotel in another name. Studio swept by people who know how to lift fingerprints off wishful thinking. A window angle that turned her cranes into noise. Park took Kincaid to coffee on paper invented for depositions. They sat in a diner that had learned not to be charming. Kincaid wrapped his hands around his mug like a person trying to learn how to be warm. "You like to write for the record on things," Park said. Not a question. "I like registers," Kincaid said. "I like their promises." "You ever think promises can be crimes?" "Only when they're broken," Kincaid said. "And then, because men like him want to be perceived as honest in rooms where honesty is an instrument. You think I drew those people?" "I think you know who did," Park said. And you think telling me makes you disloyal to a schedule you didn't make but admire. Kincaid closed his eyes briefly as if light stung. He's better than me, he said, which was not a confession and not a denial, and which contained the atmosphere men are raised inside when they worship other men's hands. He doesn't kill. He prefaces. That is his comfort. Preface what? Fate, Kincaid said sadly, because he had come to love a word that had let him be lazy. You can hate him for it, detective. He will appreciate the rigor. He won't stop. Names, Park said, soft, a man offering a way to be less lazy. Kincaid looked at the ceiling, at a stain shaped like a hand. We were boys who weren't good at boys, he said. He was better at pretending and worse at forgiving. I'm a courier because I like being told where to stand. He is a curator in the grand old sense. He thinks arranging is a sacrament. Curator where? Park asked. In rooms that don't have docents, Kincaid said. Private. You said circle. He has been there. He made me feel poor in a room that has never made me feel poor before. He wrapped drawings that were not his in linen tape because the men who owned them didn't know they were supposed to be ashamed. Name, Park said, and now the third time he said it, he wasn't offering grace. Kincaid brought his eyes down and used to noun the way men use nouns when they ring like bells in their mouths because they have been practicing them. Laurent Halbert. The Circle women would later tell Nora they'd heard the name in a tone that meant funding without questions. The Institute 4 blocks over had a scholarship named for his grandmother, who had made her money on hats and her legacy on how she learned to talk about them. Halbert collected drawings of hands like other men collect wives. His study had drawers. His register had lines bold enough to count as verbs. Initials, Park said.
LH.
Kincaid winced. He doesn't sign lists with his own letters, he said. He thinks that's vulgar. He prefers curator over collector and arranger over patron. Where's his house? Park asked. Where rooms lick themselves at night, Kincaid said. The top of the circle. A door that doesn't admit to being a door. A button that pretends not to be a bell. I can get you up if you want to be embarrassed by the carpet. He won't be there if we're too early. He makes an entrance into his own rooms. Go get your best clean jacket, Park said. And take off your cap. They went in as donors, which is to say, they requested permission to be impressed and then denied the room the satisfaction. Halbert's house was a private museum that had never had to pass an audit. Marble that had learned English late. A case of bronze hands with labels so small they were meant to be secrets. Walls hung with drawings, not paintings, sanguine studies of ears. 23 toes in various attitudes of disregard. A Montaigne knuckle that had traveled more honestly than its provenance suggested. A man like Laurent Halbert arrives when the conversation has already started and then chooses a place to stand like the law has just been amended in his favor. Mid-40s. The color called money in hair dye advertisements. Hands not clean loved. A callus that lives where pens live. Not a pencil man. A fountain pen man who has scolded clerks for saying nib when they meant feed. You're the detective, he said to Park, and then, with the polite condescension you reserve for professions that collect verbs, to Mara. And the face. Ms. Ellison consults, Park said, as if he were introducing a consultant to a problem Halbert had earned. And you are? Mara asked, because letting men set the register is a crime in this taxonomy. Laurent, he said. Halbert. Do pronounce the L in Laurent. It is vulgar to insist others speak our languages. It is a courtesy to help them. Der. He poured without waiting. His cups were thin enough to make men with too much grip nervous. We've had a morning, Park said. We came to look at your drawers. Not the first to make that joke in this room, Halbert said, without irritation, which told Mara he had been fawned over early and had learned to make it feel like permission. He gestured at a bank of flat files that had been stained the color men call library when they're performing. He slid a drawer like a benediction. The paper smelled right. Linen tape corners kissed. Bone folder in the left-hand slot. A roll of cotton tie in the right. A pencil, Connie, 2H, nestled in a groove a hand had cut. Everything correct. Everything theatrical.
No vast. No grapite smir.
Nothing to suggest anyone had leaned here and made a decision with a piece of wood. You rap like registrars, Nora said quietly from behind Park's shoulder. She had insisted on coming. It was her day in the calendar, and she refused to outsource dignity. Who taught you to love corners? The women who know how to do things, Halberd said, with the light contempt of an ally who has learned to perform being won. Do not make me quote the salary differences. It will ruin your tea. Men make speeches. Nora, was it? I own one of your outgoing loan reports. It is a masterpiece of empire. Nora did not take the compliment. She put her finger on the bone folder and moved it 1 centimeter. Halberd noticed and smiled like a child hurt politely. You think me vain, he said to Mara. You are right. I am vain about the right nouns. Lauron, Kincaid said, and the name was unwise coming from his mouth. He lowered his eyes as if he had been caught playing without permission. Kincaid, Halberd said, indulgent and predatory in a sentence. You brought the courier, who prefers casein. Detective, are you here to confiscate my linen tape? We're here to talk about schedules, Park said. He slid the plastic copy of the lifted plate onto the table. The white letters washy and sure. HR, 14 jail, 21 ME, 21 NL, 14 SD, 6 in advance. He watched Halberd look. Not the way guilty men look when shown a thing they made. The way men look when shown a thing they have been waiting for someone else to admire. My dear, Halberd said to Mara, turning to her because her initials gave him permission to speak personally. That is a list. List makers are a religion. We are tiresome. We think the act of anticipating a thing absolves the thing of rudeness. If you mean to arrest me for it, perhaps make a list first. You wrote it, Park said. I write many things, Halberd said. Registers. Checks. Notes to men who deserve encouragement without flattery and are often too brittle to accept either. I did not write this one. The hand is earnest. One of my boys. Harlan, perhaps. He smiled sideways. Wicked. You do write beautifully, Harlan. Keating went white in the way pale men do when blood forgets them. I don't write on plates, he said, which was both the truth and not a defense. Who is in advance? Mara asked. She stepped closer to the open drawer and inhaled the linen and starch and pretend of the room. The register in Halberd's case had headings with names, acquisitions, loans, promised, written in a hand that had taught itself copperplate in late adulthood. The pages turned with money. It is a phrase for the gods, Halberd said. Piety in ledger form. You make lists. You are forgiven in advance for your appetite. Do you know someone who would write it there? Park asked. On a list of initials and days. Halberd looked at the ceiling, a man pretending to think for the benefit of men who arrived late to a conversation. If I were you, he said slowly, I would look at the person who loves my drawers more than I do. The one who stays after I leave to fix my corners. Your Kincaid loves me because I let him rap. He is not my only sinner. Name, Park said. Julian Averill, Halberd said, taking pleasure in landing the vowel. He says he is an auctioneer. He is a curator without a room. He has keys to my elevator and opinions about fixatives. He wraps his jokes in linen. He also cannot draw ears to save his life. Halberd smiled at Mara as if flattery were oxygen. He could not draw yours. Initials? Nora asked, already cataloging. J. On your plate, Halberd said. There is a JL. I do not have a JL in my confidences. There is, however, a JA in my bad habits. Do you let him into the loading dock? Park asked. I let him into every part of my life that will accept linen tape, Halberd said. Park's phone said go in the kind of text you send with a period at the end because punctuation scares men into dignity. Averill, Circle, Antique Auctions, delivered crates unrecorded, seen with Kincaid. Dillard student? He looked at Halberd, at the drawer, at the bone folder laid in its little groove like a lore. He made a decision because decisions are how you take time back from people who think it is theirs. Invite him, Park said. We are closed, Halberd said primly. Invite him anyways, Nora said, the tone curatorial, not civic. And give him a list. They set the room again, second act.
Te apouret.
Drawers open. Linen poured into piles that pretended not to need counting. The YesDA plate, its black surface avoid men's hands invent themselves on, under a sheet of student stock placed next to Halberd's register. Park stood by the window because he prefers light. Kincaid folded and refolded his cap in his pocket until it had turned into a confession. Dillard made a half-page of notes on noses and turned it upside down so Averill, when he arrived, would be forced to choose between looking at the work and looking at the vanity. Julian Averill came in with the air of a man who does not knock because knocking is for men who doubt doors. Early 40s with a deliberate youth of expensive olive oil. Left-handed, which Mara clocked in the angle of his shirt cuff. A black jacket cut to persuade cameras he was thinner than honesty. He kissed Halberd's cheek in the European way that men use to save hands for pencils and to show policemen that their wrists are clean. "You rang," he said, amused, and then saw Nora, and fell into the stance men assume when registrars enter. Performative humility. "Ms. Laird, forgive me for the thing with the panel last fall. I realize now the title condition. Hope was silly, and I respect your opinion on solvents when you are the one who has to write the report." "Sit," Nora said, not forgiving. She gestured to the station by the YesDA and the register. "We are writing lists." Averill made a small delighted noise because he is the kind of person who can be baited with stationery. He took the pen Halberd offered him, paused, then put it down as if ashamed. "No fountain pens in the study," he recited. "Graphite only. I am your obedient boy." He took the pencil from the slot. He wrote, large, careless, like a man who has never been told to make a line carry its own weight, bequest to be sorted. He underlined it with a flourish that would leave a deep groove in the plate beneath if there had been a plate beneath. "Your habit," Halberd said, fondly cruel. "We should all have such problems." Averill laughed, then leaned over the register to add, in the margin, "Noses to D." He meant the plaster. He meant Dillard, who looked as if someone had gifted him a swear word he hadn't yet earned. Averill's left hand left the smudge south of his words that left-handers leave. He did not notice. In the corner of Halberd's page, where the student stock lay casually on its denim weights, he wrote, almost as a signature, "For the record." Nora turned away then, as if to sneeze, and in that quarter turn lifted the mylar and slid it aside and slid a fresh black sheet underneath and turned on the YesDA. Dust fell. Letters rose. For the record, in Averill's pressure a little too deep, trying too hard to make things permanent. Beneath it, from another time, lighter and steadier and more ruthless by 10 degrees of wrist. LH 0. Halberd put a hand to his chest, very faintly delighted. "He has a sense of humor," he said. "Of course he does." Park stepped into Averill's light with his badge held low, because it's kinder that way. "Mr. Averill," he said, "you're coming with us. We're going to have you write names on paper that will keep your letters honest." Averill did not flinch. Men who have spent their adult lives in rooms with nice drawers often interpret arrest as a kind of conversation. "For the record," he said, playing, already writing his press release on the inside of his mouth. "For the register," Nora said, and her voice, when it takes on that "we are in my room" resin, can keep gods in chairs. "You don't get to keep your schedule in here. We have our own." Chapter 7. Pressure and Proof. Interrogations in this city do not take place in rooms with two-way mirrors unless someone needs a photograph. They happen at tables that have seen coffee rings and lives rerouted. Park sat across from Julian Averill and turned the pen on his knuckle like a man who had unlearned fidgeting to make space for thought and had allowed one small habit to survive. Averill had complied in the theatrical way, hands visible, cufflinks quiet, left-handed flourish kept in check because the paper on the table was cheap and he was incapable of ruining cheap things without feeling low. He had been permitted to keep his jacket. He had not asked for counsel yet, which meant he still believed the room was a salon. "You know what this is, Mr. Averill," Park said, sliding a sheet of student stock between them and tapping the black mylar of the YesDA plate nestled under it. "You will forgive the drama." "I adore the drama," Averill said lightly. "It's the meringue on the pie. What I don't like is boredom." "Good," Park said, and nodded to the tech by the cabinet. The tech placed on the table a pencil, a bone folder, and a square of linen tape, as if he were setting a place. "Write," Park said. "Write what you always write. We can all go home sooner." Avril smiled because someone in the room had done their reading. He took the pencil in his left hand, turned it until the graphite, met his fingers like an instrument he preferred, and wrote, large and insouciant, "For the record." He underlined it twice, left-handed smudge in the wake. He added, because he couldn't help himself, in advance, smaller, in parentheses, a joke inside a joke for people who weren't listening. "Seal it," Park said. Avril tore the linen square and pressed it to the corner the way a man sticks stamps on confessions he wants the world to see. The tech brought down the charge bar. The dust fell. The words rose stark as bones in snow. "Now," Park said, and slid the plastic of the lifted plate from Nora's study across the table, the ghost writing that had brought them here. "Esti, 6NL, 14ME, 21HR, 14JL, 21 in advance." Write the same hand and the same pressure. Avril looked and made a face, the one men make when asked to perform an intimacy they prefer to choreograph. He traced the letters in the air and then shook his head. "That's not me," he said, and there was no woundedness in it. There was professional critique. Too tidy, too earnest. "Then whose?" Mara asked from the door, not crossing the threshold, not letting his nostrils have her perfume as data. "And don't say one of my boys. Pick a name you can bear to admit to." Avril's smile shifted, a degree less bright, a degree more useful. "There's a station between my vanity and your criminal," he said. "A good station. It has drawers of the kind you like, Ms. Ellison, and stainless steel trays with drains. It has men who say hold breath without sentiment. It has lights that obey. He worked there. He loved it first." "Name," Park said, and this time it was not patient. Avril flicked his gaze to the corner of the room the way people do when they summon the kind of courage that merely requires admittance rather than action. "Jasper Lynn," he said. "Medical photographer. School of Medicine. Basement." When the university closed the imaging lab on Fairview for the renovation, they moved his kingdom to the bowels, where all kingdoms go to rest. He's the kind of man who pretends he hates windows but sighs when someone paints him one. "JL?" Nora said from behind Park, and allowed herself the smallest exhale that was not relief. The plate didn't lie. "Jasper," Avril said, almost fond. "He came upstairs to me once at Halberd's, and we burned his retinas with our lamps. He said we were all obtuse, and I loved him instantly. He takes pictures of the insides of people in such a way that people working on them remember they are not objects. He catalogs. He doesn't collect." "Does he draw?" Mara asked. Avril glanced at the plastic copy of her face on Nora's table. He didn't gloat. Avril isn't cruel, he's vain. He used to make his own anatomical plates for surgeons who insist on old methods. Graphite. Casein, the sweet kind that cakes if you don't clean the nozzle. He goes in from the skull. He'd laugh at noses drawn like chocolates. "Access," Park said. "To the loading dock. To the study. To people before they die. Anyone who can say donor with a straight face can come in our back door," Avril said. But Jasper doesn't show off. He loathes seeing himself in photographs, so he does not make other men put him in their cameras either. He raps like a registrar because we taught him to, and he taught us to be ashamed of how we touched paper before him. "You'll sign a statement," Park said. "I'll write you a register," Avril said, and then, softening for once without posing, "Detective, he thinks he's protecting us from randomness. That is the most dangerous kind of merciful." They hit the medical school with permission, not drama. Park made the dean call it on a landline, so the building would take the imperative seriously. Stone. Brass plaques that think they still matter. A guard whose face said, "I can be your enemy if you make me be," and who became their ally when Nora whispered, "We're saving drawers." Jasper Lynn's studio was majorly underground and a little underwater. A room lined in white tile that had nicks where lives had been the reason people were graceless, ductwork that lent the air of a serotonin, stainless steel tables that paid tax to gravity every day and won. Along one wall, flat files, the caskets, again, repurposed from a shut print shop, their paint worn off at the pulls by hands who love drawers. A rack of lights with barn doors set like eyelids. 2 enlargers that looked like architecture. A shelf of albums with spines labeled orthopedic pre-op, dermatology consults, plastics consent. Paper cranes hung from the sprinkler pipe, which Mara tried not to think of as a compliment and failed. Lynn stood there when they arrived, not performing surprise, which told Mara 2 useful things. He is not a man who expects to be left alone, and he respects rooms enough to let them register their own intrusions before he begins to perform his person. He was thinner than Averil's words had made her expect, narrower of shoulder, the type of men who wear their jackets like criticism. Hands clean, yes, long fingers with a photographer's refusal to damage cuticles. A callus in a place only graphite makes, at the lower joint where a pencil rests when you draw from the heel. Jasper Lynn.
Park said.
He held his badge out like a noun he was willing to subject to Lynn's scorn. Lynn looked at the badge as if its typography offended him. "That's me," he said. His voice was tired without being weak. "No one tells me you're coming, because no one believes my door is a door." "We've been invited to your drawers," Nora said, stepping to the flat files like a woman who has forgiven many men and intends to forgive none today. "May I?" Lynn hesitated for a heartbeat that revealed he is not an authoritarian. He is a perfectionist. "If you don't blow on anything," he said, and unlocked the top drawer with a small key shaped like chagrin. Inside, in folders labeled the way men label when they believe they will have to find things for other people later, were proofs on fiber paper, contact sheets, and Mara recognized the smell before her eyes pinned it down, rag stock with graphite on it. He did not advertise the things he did after hours. He simply filed them where he could reach them and pretend he had always meant to show them to responsible grown-ups. Park didn't touch. He let the room do the leaning. "Mr. Lynn," he said, "someone is making drawings of people weeks before they die and delivering them like truth. One of those drawings is of a person whose face I intend to keep an argument forever. We have a lifted plate with JL 21 on it. We have linen tape corners that behave like yours. We have paper bought by one of your friends in a batch you prefer. We have an inflated sense of our own luck. You can correct us if you like." Lynn didn't go to outrage. He went to process. He closed the drawer, opened the second, pulled a folder labeled studies, head planes, and laid on the table a page that could have been a cousin to the museum's. Skulls blocked in with rational lines. Cheek planes suggested with kind hatch. A mouth that had not yet been asked to be pretty. The strokes had patience. There was cruelty only where it belonged. Under cartilage, in the faithful rendering of shadow. "I don't kill people," he said quietly. "I record. Sometimes I draw them before they are recorded. That was my sin. I made the record the wrong way around." "Why?" Mara asked, not as a cop, as a person who knows the pull of a ritual that pretends to be a room. He looked at the tiles, then at the cranes, then at the drawer he had permitted to be opened. "Because randomness is an insult," he said. "Because I watch lives go under my lens, and I am told to catalog them, and cataloging is acceptable until you meet a person whose cheek knows where their skull is, and you want to write it down before anyone else is allowed to pretend they invented them. Because I could. Because I had friends who invited me to rooms where men arrange things, and say that arranging is mercy. Because I wanted to show them what an honest arrangement looked like." "You drew them," Park said, calm when calm matters. "And then I mailed them to places where people would remember to file them," he said. "Museums, galleries, police." He looked at Mara and did not apologize.
"You."
He, Halberd, liked to preface things. "I thought if I prefaced them harder and better, the world would deign to be rearranged into a safer schedule." "And then they died," Mara said, because someone had to say it like a civilian. He flinched in a whole-body way that made even Dillard, who had come because he has a compulsion to stand under light he respects, look away. "Then they died," Lynn said. "Not because I drew them. If I had that power, I would draw entire hospitals in permanent charcoal. Because someone else loved the same drawers we did and wanted to test whether my records were accurate." "Name," Park said. Lynn exhaled. "You are asking me to choose a father," he said. "Do you understand that? Yes, Park said. Do it anyway. Lin put both hands on the stainless steel table and let its chill remind him of the promises he didn't know he had made. Laurent Halberd chose the subjects because he thinks some faces deserve to be catalogued before they leave us, he said. Julian Averill wrote lists because lists are the way he disguises hunger. Harlan Keating carried paper up and corners down. I drew because I needed to prove to myself that beauty and record are the same word when the lights are correct. And someone with less patience and more righteousness took the schedule and made it neat. Who? Mara said. Lin's mouth tightened. The dean's nephew, he said, a sentence that dropped like cutlery and sounded like it had been waiting to. Jack LeMaine. Jail if you read his mail badly, and mine well. Med student with pretensions toward making tree of into an aesthetic. He wants the world to reward him for being able to stand longer than the people beside him. He watched me work one night and said, "It's like you are telling the future with bones." He was the first person who loved me wrong. Jack LeMaine, Park repeated.
JL.
2 JLS. He borrowed my initials, Lin said, tired and finally angry in a way that looked almost wholesome on him. He thought it would make him invisible. Where do we find him? Nora asked. In the corner of every room where an action can be turned into an argument, Lin said. But at 3 a.m. he sleeps in the call room behind orthopedics and dreams he is the person who gets to decide who bows. He likes to write on the covers of his books with a mechanical pencil so the indentations look like zeal. Warrants, Park said to nobody and everybody. He texted 6 words and watched the room change temperature. Mr. Lin, he added, turning back, you will come with us and you will draw while we put him in a chair. You will draw his hand. Lin's eyes, which had been dutiful, got meaner in the useful way. I have been waiting, he said. They found Jack LeMaine where Lin predicted he would be, sprawled on a foam couch under fluorescent hum, the kind of sleep people in hospitals wear like a bandage. One not granted. He sat up with all the reflex of a man born with a name and learned how to make nurses apologize. He made his mouth do charm and found it not the right instrument. Detective, he said, when he was shown the badge, because the medical school teaches a certain repertoire and how to deploy it. Is there a problem? Just a register we need you to contribute to, Park said. He sat him at a staff room table under a bulletin board that held pizza coupons and organ donation pamphlets and a poem cut out of a journal that had made a surgery resident cry, and no one had taken it down because it seemed to help. He placed on the table a student sheet, a bone folder, a pencil. Lin, at the far end, began to draw. Not LeMaine's face. His hand. The posture of his fingers when he reached for the pencil. The callus on the thumb pad where clamp handles live. The faint half-moons where scrub cuffs rub. The pressure of the index when it presses down, the hypotenar muscle as it tightens because some men never learn to write without trying to make the world feel it. Write for the record, Park said. LeMaine smirked because he had loved the phrase too long in secret. He wrote it more beautifully than Averill ever would, less deeply, more impatiently. Left-handed, but only for instruments, he wrote with his right. The dust on the USDA rose obligingly. The letters, not the same as Averill's, not as earnest as the plate that had wrecked their week, were cousins to the indentations beneath Nora's copy. Park slid the lifted mylar across. The room watched LeMaine watching a ghost of his own schedule. He swallowed. What is this? Your ambition showing through the paper, Nora said, level. I didn't kill anyone, he said, and for the first time there was honest fear on his face, the kind that doesn't ask to be absolved, just to be believed long enough to be useful. I put people where the schedule needed them to be seen. That's not killing. That's curating. Lin's pencil made a small sound on the paper, like an or entering water. He didn't look up when he said, you held breath for them. I told them to, LeMaine snapped, and then smaller. I stood in rooms where breath was the thing that had to be asked for out loud. And then I stood in rooms where breath was useless. You whispered it into our paper, Mara said, stepping close enough to make him feel other human geometry. Hold breath. You wrote it on my name. Did you come to my studio? He grimaced in contempt that pretended not to envy. I came to your building when your cranes were making a noise in the window, And I learned that the city gives some people light with too much kindness, he said. I wanted it to be fair. You made a schedule, Park said. Now you can make a statement. Lemaine looked at Lynn's drawing. It was not flattering. It was everything he had hoped his hand was: competent, decisive, efficient, and everything he had feared it would be: unkind in the wrong places. He began to talk all at once. That special talk doctors learn in court to unspool many verbs until the one that hurts most can hide in the weave. He gave them dates, rooms, times he had stood at loading docks and learned how to use his cap like Kincaid, times he had slipped upstairs at Halberds and watched men arrange arrangements and decided to test them. He said Averill never touched anyone who did not request to be wrapped first. He said Keating made lists but not schedules. He said Jasper drew to calm himself and then couldn't, which is the kind of sentence that is worth a season of testimony. And the killing, Park said at last, because here was the part where men confess if they're going to, or make a speech that a jury will enjoy punishing. Who put fingers on throats? Who stopped breath? Lemaine stared at the table. There was a ring from a cup, washed and still a ring because stainless has a memory. It would please you to have one villain, he said tonelessly. It would please me to oblige your desire for symmetry. But randomness has more imagination than you. Two died by somebody who loved drama more than process. One did what grief does when you hand it a schedule. He saw his own drawing and decided to make it true. One died of a body that didn't ask permission. I am a man who loves lines. I made them. I did not break the necks that followed them. You set a stage, Park said. We'll put you on one. Lynn lifted his drawing of the hand and waited. It was not a trophy. It was a register. You owe me your initials, he said to Lemaine without rancor. You wrote mine on a plate without asking. Lemaine swallowed and looked like a boy as he whispered, JL, and then louder, Jack Lemaine. You may write it big. Park stood. The room put him at respect without instructions. Someone shut off an autoclave. Somebody else tossed a cup. Cuffs, he said, and then to Lynn. Keep the pencils. They walked Lemaine out through corridors that have seen larger shames than this and will again. Halbert's lawyer would later try to fold him back into a schedule that made wealthy men feel clever and fail, in the unromantic way failing happens when a county clerk gets to write what comes next. Keating went outside and breathed like a person whose lungs were not an intellectual exercise. Averill asked if they would like him to issue a statement for the circle and was told, politely, no. On the sidewalk, under a sky that had found a generous temperature, Mara handed Lynn a copy of the plastic plate with his initials attached to a number that had made her move hotels. He explored it with one fingertip, as if reading Braille. I'll write you a new one, she said. A different kind of register. What goes on it, he asked. People we keep alive by making them bored, she said.
Chairs.
Water. Windows.
Lights.
We've been practicing. His mouth did not smile. It did something rarer for him. It forgave a room for letting someone else finish a sentence. Chapter 8, 0 Days. You never get all your nouns back at once. They come home like pets who have spent a winter under porches elsewhere, thinner, cannier, still able to sleep with their heads on your shoes. Jack LeMayne's confession made donors panic. The circle behaved like a chorus, and the newspapers decide, correctly, for once, that art had never been the villain. Vanity had. The district attorney preferred conspiracies when they could be sold as pedagogy. Park liked the word conspiracy because it meant he would get to keep everyone in the same room longer than they wanted to be and force the architecture of their sentences to reveal who had built what. One piece remained rude, and it sat under glass where Nora could scold it every time she walked by. LH, 0. Halberd's initials, 0 days. Already passed? Tonight? Earlier in the week? The math of spite isn't reliable, but you respect it because ignoring it just makes it ambitious. Could be the list's anchor, Keating suggested, flipping through a binder of call records with the eagerness of a man being allowed to categorize something people care about. 0 the present, 14 the polite reminder, 21 the ceremonial. Could be a joke, Averill said, subdued, a little hoarse from the effort of not speaking in paragraphs for the first time in years. Laurent likes to make himself exception and rule in one stroke. Could be tonight, Nora said. And my calendar doesn't forgive men who threaten to become exhibits. Halbert, told as much in his house, pretended to be surprised with the grace of a man who knows he is not allowed to be bored. 0 is always today, he said mildly, and poured tea like someone practicing a vestige of a civilization that has not survived contact with reality. Would you like to stage a raid in my drawers, detective? You may have your spectacle. Not spectacle, Park said. A study session. He looked around the study with its thin cups and plates that preferred to be touched by linen. You'll invite your friends. I'll invite mine. Ms. Laird will bring her yestie. Ms. Ellison will sit where men can't help drawing her and ruin their day by knowing more about their bones than they do. I love a salon, Halbert said, and his eyes, which had always been charming, got cunning. He enjoys being the target if the conversation will be clever. Who writes the list? You did, Park said, and watched the smallest flicker of something like satisfaction cross Halbert's mouth. Everything is vanity. The trick is to make it hold a door instead of closing one. They set the study again. Last act. Drawers open, lists made, linen tape corners present to keep men from improvising. Yestie charged. Invitations sent not in cream stock with copperplate but via text because men who need to be in rooms will arrive whether addressed elegantly or not. Keating, posted at the door like an usher who insists on taking your coat because he loves the ritual, stopped 3 people without badges and let in 1 man with a cap and 2 women with defiant chins. Dillard put the plaster nose at the end of the table again, because some jokes can be pieties. Mara sat where her portrait had been made true and very carefully refused to be a subject, head turned a degree the artist had not permitted, mouth holding a smile she would never offer him. She kept the cranes in her pocket, like a rosary for rationalists. Nora drifted from drawer to drawer with her pen poised, writing no and yes on tabs that would be read later as policy. Halbert played host as if he had never played anything else. He made people feel seen. It's a dangerous kindness. He used it to seat Lemaine's colleagues away from him and Keating beside men who need to be taught how to touch cotton. Averill, nicked and tempered by the last 2 days, fetched water and did not come up with a sentence to justify his thirst. He was learning. At 8:56, the elevator purred. At 8:57, the bell pretended not to be a bell. At 8:58, a man who had been born taught to be beautiful and had discovered work when it was almost too late stepped into the room with a portfolio tucked under his arm, as if it were merely punctuation. Laurent Halbert, who had been pouring tea, looked at himself in a mirror made of men and practiced not flinching. The man, tall, old boy handsome the way certain magazines taught men to be 30 years ago, smiled just enough. He wasn't dressed to be invisible. He was dressed to be permitted in any room if he stood still enough and spoke as if he had just remembered his mother. He set the portfolio on the table with the kind of decency that misleads and undid the ties with ritual he had not earned. Nora's I shook once, then settled. He knew how to kiss corners and fold back linen tape without tugging. He was not Averill.
He was not Keating.
He was not Lynn. He was the kind of person who grows in the spaces where talented men let someone else do the verbs. Park let the man make his mistake. For the record, the man said, just loudly enough for everyone to hear it as charm and not hubris, and slid a fresh drawing out onto the table. Halbert, in graphite, vivid and calm, not flattered, the slack of a mouth between sentences, the little network of creases where men who smirk for a living inadvertently drink, the hair disobedient at the side part, the eyes kind or cruel, depending on where you stand. There was the slightest pressure mirror at the clavicle because every artist who draws fast has the spice. R&F in the corner. The scent of casein, the way milk haunts rooms that remember it. Title on the verso, lower left, tidy, head study LH, evening light. A little involuntary DC of breath went around the table. Halbert took the hit beautifully. When a room loves you, and you have finally earned it, you do not squander that currency on flinching. He looked at his own face and said, "It's rude to be pleased," in a tone that suggested he'd consider being rude for the right audience. "Hold your hands where we can see them," Park said to the courier, in practice to the man. 2 plainclothes stepped into the doorway. Keating braced. Dillard made the small noise churchgoers make when someone else kneels first. Jack, Mara said, because the hand on the paper had not been a stranger. The deep patience in the hatch, the little cruelty in where the lines jammed under the nose, the obedient positional of the letters on the verso. Don't ruin your life twice. LeMaine, behind Park, made it sound like someone who has sat on a splinter and refused to move until company leaves. I never had this nerve, he said, bitter and admiring and ashamed. The man smiled, and now the charm collapsed. The skin wore its true geometry. Who said nerve, he said. I'm only punctual. It wasn't LeMaine. It was not Halberd. He did not draw. It was not Keating. His line is too careful, too fearful. It was not Lynn. Lynn's cruelty stays under the skin, where it belongs. The man coming forward with the portfolio had the pressure of someone who enjoyed being exact where violence would have been less work. He slid his hand across the table toward the bone folder, and then paused because even rude men sometimes love correct rooms more than they love their own needs. Nora, Park said. Nora, who had placed the student stock and the black mylar under it as if she were building a sandwich, gently pulled the linen tape he had set aside closer to the corner and said, "Would you prefer to seal your own fate?" He looked at her like a man who's found his match in an unexpected genre. He tore the tape, pressed it to the corner, wrote, in that tidy cataloger's lower left hand, the number 0 beside LH, because he loved completing schedules more than he loved any of the faces on them. Park reached for his wrist before the pressure left the plastic. The YesDA sang its soft static. The letters rose. Name, Park said, and was done asking. Lauren, the man said, cocking his head toward Halbert's portrait. He was in love with the coincidence of names, the way doppelgangers let men get away with murder in novels. You knew that. Your actual one, Mara said, because the room had been charming too long, and she was finished with it. The man's mouth, freed, said, Lee Halbert, and for a moment you could see the child who had had to share a last name with money and had decided to become its archivist. I sign LH because it is my right. I am the register. Halbert made a sound that would reside in the study's corners for years, a small sin becoming contrition late. Lee, he said, God save me. Brother? Keating asked, appalled and gratified by the symmetry. Cousin, Halbert said, and shut his mouth before family history tried to make itself art. Lee Halbert, LH, who had written 0 beside his own surname because 0 is today, and because boys raised inside the same nomenclature like to test how many doors their inherited nouns will open, did not run. He looked at Park's hands on his wrists like a man inspecting a joinery he wished he had built better. He turned, politely, to face the camera he imagined someone was holding because he is the sort of man who believes documentation will save him from being boring. Why? Nora asked, though she didn't have to. Registrars ask to refine. Why the drawings? Why the schedule? Why the tape? Because people like you refuse to let beauty get away with itself, he said, and the room bristled because he had said something like a compliment and made it ugly. Because someone had to make a register of faces no one would care about after a week of weather. Because I don't kill. I underline. I place. I honor. He stopped because even men like Lee can sometimes hear how offensive their rhetoric becomes when it runs out of nouns and tries to pasture in verbs it hasn't earned. You made a list and asked the world to act like it was a god, Mara said. You mistook order for virtue. It is to me, he said simply. And that was the whole small religion of it. The schedule had felt like mercy inside his head. The practice of it had produced graves. Park took him away without drama because drama was the element of men like Lee. He didn't let him touch linen again. He didn't let him pretend this was a salon where cleverness could reframe anything. He let the room go back to being a study. Halbert sat down then, for the first time that day truly bereft of performance. He looked at his own portrait and put one hand flat on the table beside it the way believers steady themselves on pews. 0, he said, a little toneless. It's not today anymore, Nora said briskly, which is exactly the kind of mercy people like Halbert deserve from registrars. Resolute, unsentimental, correct. She slid the drawing into a sleeve. This goes in evidence, she added, because sometimes that word gets to be the answer that closes a room. Keating, whose world composes itself more easily when nouns have been put into fresh folders, fetched a label and wrote L.H. Lee. Seized and then, smaller, as if to comfort the box more than the contents. Honor deferred. Dillard put the plaster nose back into his bag, with that petting motion that people use when they're embarrassed by loving an object. Mara walked to the window, opened it a crack, and let the city in. She does this when rooms think too highly of themselves. The air came in and did what air does. Leveled. Made corners tolerable. She took out of her pocket one of the paper cranes and set it on the edge of Halbert's demonstration of how things should be.
For schedule, she said.
Not of it. For it. Later, in the loading dock where all art bows, Park stood with Nora and watched Kincaid teach a younger courier how to tuck a tie without catching the tooth of the paper. We'll convict him, Park said. For conspiracy, for tampering, for the way men like that are guilty of too many nouns at once. Lynn will testify to where lists go when people are bored. Lemaine will make himself sound dreary, and the jury will love punishing dreary. And the dead, Nora said, writing on a card in that little neat hand the USDA loves so much. List dismantled. How do we serve them? With chairs, Park said unexpectedly, a man who had borrowed another town's wisdom once and kept it. Water. Windows.
Lights.
With boredom that keeps them alive the next time someone writes a list. Mara went home to her studio when the locks had new thoughts. The cranes made their small paper noises in the draft. She moved the table the last 2 inches she hadn't permitted herself earlier and made the light a liar. She taped to the window sash, at eye level, a note on student stock in a hand Lynn would recognize if he ever needed to. No more drawings in advance. You may bring coffee. She wrote it large and a little rude. She underlined it once and did not seal it with linen. Chapter 9, Chain of Custody. The courthouse pretends to be neutral and never is. The marble tries not to echo. The fluorescent hum rehearses restraint. The hallway benches forgive the backs that fold onto them morning after morning while lives are converted to exhibits. Park calls it the factory. Nora calls it off-site storage. Mara, who has drawn faces in rooms much worse than this, took a seat where she could put her hand flat against a plaster column and feel the building's shallow pulse. The docket read like a map of the last month in a language only 6 people had learned. State versus Halberd, L. Lee 2 counts. Murder in the second. Conspiracy. 2 more. Stalking and intimidation. 3 of felony tampering and mail fraud in a costume that had never seen a costume party. State versus Lemaine, J. Conspiracy, obstruction, harassment. People versus Lynn, J. Misdemeanor possession of human subject images in violation of consent protocols. Pled down with a restitution agreement and mandatory ethics seminars he had already begun to teach out of penance. People versus Averill, J. Misprision and witness interference. Deferred adjudication on condition that he never again use the phrase curatorial mercy in public without being legally obligated to define it. People versus Keating, H. Nothing criminal. 3 civil depositions, 1 apology given well. Lee Halberd came in wearing the sort of suit that believes in immortality. The cuffs and collar fit perfectly, which is how you know a man expects to be looked at and has organized his garments accordingly. He sat where defendants sit who intend to edit their role in the narrative by making each movement look like punctuation. He didn't look at Laurent. He looked at the room like a man who had furnished better. The ADA in charge of stitching the cases together had the graduate school fatigue of someone who learned how to love nouns too early. She built her opening like a registrar. Chronology first, then provenance, then the argument a jury can carry in their heads on the bus. You will hear about paper, tape, graphite, light, she said. You will be told this is about art. It is not. It is about time, and what a man thought he had the right to do with other people's minutes. Chain of Custody is a story with receipts. Nora took the stand the way she takes rooms, by placing pens where they belong and making the light find a virtue in it. She didn't dramatize the USDA. She explained it the way you teach a donor who wants to touch a salt print why they can't. Electrostatic detection doesn't tell you what a person meant, she said, looking at the jury and not at the defense. It tells you they were there. It tells you pressure. The ADA rolled the black mylar out like a modest miracle. The white letters lifted by dust. SD, 6NL, 14ME, 21 in advance, glowed the way truth sometimes does briefly before returning to its proper mat. We made these plates in our study room, Nora said. We made them again in the crime lab. We made them again under court order, in front of counsel. They match, not because we're clever, but because pressure remembers. Defense tried to make the room forget. Isn't it true, Lee's attorney asked, that artists, curators, registrars, people in your world, leave little marks on everything? That the presence of a phrase like, for the record, could be ambient? Nora blinked. In our rooms, for the record is not ambient, she said. It is a promise. We know who writes it. We now also know who used it like a costume. Jasper Lynn testified without performing shame. He brought 2 pages, 1 graphite plane study, 1 anatomical plate, because that was the only way he knew to apologize to strangers. I drew faces before they were documented because I believed the act of recording could be mercy, he said, voice a little ragged on the syllables that carry the most weight. I was wrong. I drew them because I needed a procedure to stand up under. I mailed them because registers are where I go when I'm frightened. He looked at Lee once, not for permission. He turned procedure into schedule, and schedule into a dare. Lemaine, his tie straight in the narrow way law clerks mimic while they're still trying to love themselves, tried very hard not to smile when he remembered he was not the most interesting villain in the room anymore. He admitted to standing in loading docks and whispering, hold breath, because the phrase had made him feel less useless under lights. He denied the 2 deaths the state had laid at Lee's feet. The ADA didn't force a neat shape where the facts hadn't made one. She let the deaths stand in their wretched variety. One staged by a man who wanted the page to match his list and the body to obey, one that took its own minute, one that walked to the window on the knowledge it had been appointed to a narrative and chose to beat it to the end, one that kept beating, that required no trial to remain true. Then Mara, expert first, curriculum vitae, years in the bureau, the craft of drawing a face that does not flatter, that refuses to catch a person at their prettiest lie. Then subject, because the ADA knew if she didn't ask the question the defense would ask it with a grin. You were drawn. Yes, Mara said. She kept her hands folded, so she wouldn't be tempted to sketch a prosecutor's profile on the witness box. The cornea of the drawing held a reflection I recognized. It showed my window, and the cranes. Your cranes?
Paper, she said.
From a student who forgave me for hating them when I was young. The defense tried the cheap route. Ms. Ellison, they said, given your involvement, isn't it true you cannot be objective about the quality of this drawing or its maker? I am not objective, she said calmly. I am trained. She let the pause be a lesson. The hand that drew me is the same hand that drew Lauren Halbert, which is the same hand that wrote a 0 next to LH. On the lifted plate. That is not an opinion. It is a matter of pressure, stroke direction, and the bad habit of pressing too hard at the clavicle. I recognize this vice because I envy the rest. The jury laughed once, then quieted. You could feel them decide she was allowed to own a little envy and still be believed. Park took the stand like furniture. He laid out the visits to Prentice, the decoy camera, the linen tape in Mara's trash, the study sessions, the decision to invite villains into correct rooms and disarm them with rules. He did not take credit for luck. He wrote the narrative the way he writes reports, verbs in the right column, adjectives rationed. Defense tried to pull him into an aesthetic argument. He kept returning to doors. He brought a portrait of Mr. Halbert to a public room and wrote 0 in the corner because he loves completion more than outcomes, Park said. We arrested him because we love outcomes more than anyone's habits. Lee himself asked to speak. The lawyer grimaced. The court nodded. Men like Lee believe in the clarifying power of their own sentences.
He didn't confess.
He curated. He used the word register 3 times and honor twice and mercy twice too many. He said he never laid a hand, that he had only pointed. He said the world had been improved by acknowledging, in advance, what it refuses to in the moment. He did not say I when he should have, and he did not say sorry, which is the only word that ever makes sentences smaller on purpose. When court broke that day, Laurent stood in the corridor with his hands folded like a man who has been informed he is a portrait and intends, perversely, to behave. "Cousin," he said softly as Park steered Lee past. "I should have recognized your hand. It was the one our grandfather cared about." Lee smiled with that small cruelty men reserve for the people who share their nouns. "You were always easier to draw," he said, and turned his face into the last good light he would see for a while, as if that were a kind of victory. Verdict took long enough to respect the evidence and short enough for Park to tell himself the factory could surprise him. Guilty on the 2 murders. Guilty on the rest. The jurors avoided eye contact with the names on the lists and glanced toward Nora when they filed out, as if a registrar could absolve them for having had to make a decision in a room with incorrect chairs. Lemaine pled to conspiracy and obstruction and left the building with a sentence that will give him too much time to imagine himself as the protagonist of a cautionary tale he doesn't deserve to narrate. Avril walked out with terms that made him flinch behind his mouth. Quarterly audits of his charity, a 5-year ban from acting as courier, without supervision, and a personal letter from Nora with 3 bullet points labeled no, no, still no. Keating shook Park's hand in the parking lot like a man trying to forgive his lungs for how often they get ahead of him. Lynn went back to his tiles and his cranes and his lights and filed a policy under his door. No anatomical drawing without consent forms / 2 witnesses / tea afterward. Mara bought a cake. She does not throw parties. She makes excuses for sugar in rooms that have earned it. She took the cake to the study center and laid it on the table where the Yes DA cart had lived. Nora produced plates from the sorcery-covered museum's keep for the staff's long nights. Dillard cut slices as if politeness were relief. Park leaned against the doorframe and realized he had stopped bracing. They ate. They didn't make speeches. It was, for once, enough. On her way out, Mara paused at the glass case that had become a small, proper shrine to procedure. A roll of linen tape under a card that read "Not for sale," a bone folder with its edge dulled by correct use, a mylar with list dismantled lettered in Nora's hand. She took out of her coat pocket a ticket stub from a show the city had refused to love until it learned how, and slid it under the edge of the card. On loan from Luck, she wrote in pencil, and smiled at her own small superstition. Night fell. The museum breathed. The city put its faces back on. And the paper in the drawers slept like good dogs, vigilant, humble, ready. Chapter 10. The Register of the Living.
Spring then.
The city's habit of forgiving itself when the light changes. On Prentice, the handbag store arranged canvases in their window that pretended to be paper. On the square, students in paint-smeared hoodies learned, impatient and sincere, how to make a nose carry weight without asking for applause. The museum printed a simple pamphlet in the font jury's trust, procedures for viewing works on paper, hands, light, breath. Nora wrote it so the public would learn to be accomplices. She did not include no prophecy. She didn't have to. The case with the linen tape did that work by existing. Dillard renamed his Wednesday session. From the casket became from the living, and he let the title be a little sentimental because he'd earned the right to irritate himself. He still taught cartilage. He taught it more kindly. The planes still mattered. The forgiveness did, too. Harlan kept a ledger of paper sold with full names and receipts, not because anybody ordered him to, but because he had learned he preferred the feeling of having nothing to hide to the thrill of hoarding good rag. Avril, who had always loved a register for the way it made him feel useful, began cataloging community collections for free on Fridays and refused to let anyone thank him in public. He is vain. He is changing. He hates that it feels better than speeches. Lynn called Mara the first morning he installed his new rule. "I wrote no 3 times on my door," he said. "It tastes like learning to be useful." "Come upstairs," she said. "I have a thing." She had been thinking about it since the trial. Not a counter-exhibit, not therapy by drawing, not the ego trip that artists allow themselves when they think they're saving a town. A procedure. She called it the Register of the Living because the words made her laugh and because they made bureaucrats nod. The sign in her studio window was block letters, taped crooked on purpose. Portrait hours. Consent required. Title yourself.
No dates. No futures.
Coffee between sittings. The rules were a kindness disguised as a dare. People came. Shy, then less so. A nursing student with a white line where her mask strap had been for 2 years, who wanted to be titled tired without permission, and then changed it to practicing. The feed store boy who could not sit still during the warm-up but held motion like a genius when she put a pencil in his hand and called him Raymond's nephew because he asked for it that way. A woman who had been married to a man who made lists without chores and preferred to be titled Violet because she liked how it felt in her mouth. They signed their own cards. They wrote their own notes. They picked the corner the title went in. Mara kept the habit of showing them the reflections in their irises, as if to say, here is your light. Claim it. Nora came on a Saturday with her sleeves rolled and a cake box that said not evidence in frosting. She sat for 20 minutes and titled herself registrar because it was the truest noun in the room and because she trusted Mara not to make it pretty. Mara drew her with the patience she reserves for objects. Weight before detail, bones before sentiment, then the little ridge where a life has acquiesced to its favorite jaw set. After, they wrote a policy together on the back of old brochure stock and taped it next to the sign. 1. Titles by sitter. 2. No future tenses. 3. Corrections welcome. 4. Copies allowed. 5. Originals stay in the drawer until the sitter decides otherwise. Park stopped by once a week with coffee and an expression that meant everybody alive. He would decline to sit as a matter of principle and superstition, and then perch on the radiator long enough to be sketched by accident while he talked about nuisance burglaries and a bar on ferry that had to be ushered back into fire code like a toddler. She titled his accidental profile detective furniture and put it in the drawer because the city sleeps better when some faces aren't on walls. Lauren Halberd sent a check with a letter that didn't try to be art. For chairs and lights, it said. LH, the other one. Mara returned it with a receipt for 2 stools and a roll of newsprint and a note. You may buy paper. You may not buy the register. Lee's lawyer filed papers that talk at great length about precedent. The appeal sits in a clerk's tray with other important nouns. It will be dealt with. The city does not need Mara for that part. She is grateful. Once late, Lynn came up with a portfolio and a bottle of milk he pretended was casein to make her laugh. He sat, and when she put the first line down, he reached to stop her, and then didn't, because he had learned a kind of respect for other people's rituals. Title, she asked. He thought harder than artists do when asked to be honest while still in their own rooms. Then, Jasper. Not the initials. Not the drawer. The name. He cried after. People do in that chair. She has tissues and the decency not to admire them. Summer turned the cranes in her window into little white boats. Night walks got longer. On a warm evening, Park called.
Doc, he said.
Bring your hands. Down in the loading bay, Eddie from facilities had a grin he hadn't taken out since Thanksgiving. Nora stood with a clipboard tilted, as if it were finally recording a thing she wanted to put her name to. On the cart, a package, wrapped in craft, linen tape corners kissed, penciled lower left, for the register. Not record. She looked at Nora, who shook her head. It hadn't come through the museum. Eddie held up his sign-in sheet. Courier unknown woman. Insisted on protocol, left a note. The note. You needed one of these that didn't smell like men. Mara untied the cotton tie the way she has learned to undress danger, carefully, with a compliment. Inside, a drawing on decent student stock. The nose was right. The eyes were permitted. The mouth, unapologetic. It wasn't hers or Nora's or anyone on the old plates. It was a woman with a square jaw and a scar at the lip, titled in lower left. Head study V, afternoon. The back, in a neat, uncompromised hand. Saturday.
Named self.
Left when ready. No batch number. No schedule. No in advance. In the lower right, smaller. Coffee excellent. Nora laughed like a person who suddenly believes in angel donors she can tolerate. We'll accession a copy, she said, already moving. The original goes where? In the drawer, Mara said. Until V asks for it. They didn't announce it. Word travels in cities like theirs by walking, not shouting. People came more often after that, in twos and fours, curious to try a room that was, rumor had it, better than prophecy. An old man asked to be titled Still Here, and fell asleep mid-sitting, and woke to a drawing that had given him his breathing back. A barber brought 3 kids who were allergic to standing still and taught them, gently, how to turn their fidget into line. Dillard came and sat arthritically and titled himself Sebastian Teaches, which was a good day for anybody who had learned to listen without making their posture perform. On a blue week in late July, the museum took one of Mara's copies on loan and built a modest exhibition in the study center. No masks, no velvet rope. The Register of the Living, 3 walls, a chalkboard with chalk for anyone who wanted to leave a title for themselves on the way out. The didactic label was the bravest thing Nora had ever put her name under. Procedures save lives. Lists that don't ask permission take them. Titles given by the living belong to them. She put her curator's name last and her registrar's name first, and did not apologize in the meeting when someone, narrow tie, very good hair, asked if that was on brand. On closing night, which was not a closing so much as a reminder that drawers don't care about seasons, Mara stood at the edge of the study and watched strangers move, like people who had finally learned how to be gentle with paper. The USDA cart sat under its black cloth like a small animal that only comes out when needed. Park leaned in the doorway as if doors respect him more now. Lynn traced a plane on his own cheek, absent-minded, as if memorizing his own face for later. Think we did it?
Park asked.
Stopped a religion, she said. Started a procedure. He tipped his coffee in salute. I'll take it. They closed up. Chairs on tables. Light dimmed without drama. Nora clicked the last switch off with the satisfaction of a woman who knows where every noun in the room belongs. In the dusk, the drawers breathed. They do, sometimes, if you earn it, and the paper slept. Tomorrow, there would be more faces. No futures. No in advance. That was the work. It was enough. Chapter 11, Errata. 2 weeks after the verdict, the USDA plate went back under its black cloth like a well-fed animal content to drowse until called. The study center returned to being a room that teaches light its manners and human hands their limits. We stacked chairs, we wiped tables, we restocked beanbag weights. We pretended to prefer boredom because, in this room, boredom is the procedure that keeps people alive. On a Tuesday that smelled like wet coats and dusted frames, Nora pulled the ghost plates from their drawers to write their accession notes. You cannot keep evidence in a museum without teaching it how to behave. You cannot keep a museum without admitting it has always also been a courthouse. She laid the mylar on the table, smoothed it with the back of her hand, and labeled each in her tidy registrar's script. Lift 1, study, plate from Emmy Verso. Lift 2, study, Kincaid Intervention. Lift 3, Halberd Register, Averill Hand. Lift 4, composite. Composite, I said, leaning over the table with a pencil I had promised not to use for drawing on museum property. The one with HR, 14 and LR, 28 and the rest. Nora said, the sound she makes when her mouth refuses to contribute adjectives. She reached for a sheet of vellum and overlaid it, then marked with dots the points where pressure darkened. DeLillo syntax rendered in dust. We were frightened correctly, she said. We were sloppy a little. You mean we read everything as names? I mean we read everything as names, she said, not letting me share the blame, because that is how she keeps rooms clean. Look. She took a wax crayon, that kindergarten relic every adult secretly respects, and back-rubbed the faintest corner of Lift 4. Letters rose, not initials but slashed abbreviations. HR not a person but a hematology requisition code. LR not Loron, not Lee, but loan return, a note in the margin of Halberd's own register when he meant to show off a bit of humility to a donor and remind himself to bring a drawing back from a salon. JL, 21 and Emmy. 21 stayed what they were. SD, 6 stayed a man we cared about learning to be frightened on the correct timeline. The rest became errata. There is a theological pleasure in being wrong, Nora said dryly. We write corrections. We publish them. Then we sleep. We printed a small card and set it in the case beside the bone folder, and the linen tape corners kissed, and the mylar. Errata. Reading pressure. It did not embarrass us. It reminded the public that rooms are made of people, and people are made of verbs. We left the card in Nora's hand. That afternoon, a letter arrived that the front desk didn't know what to do with. I was in the study center teaching an electrician how to count to 10 around paper when Nora appeared in the doorway with an envelope balanced on her palm like a fragile noun. No return address. Pale blue. Inside, paper that had once been stationary for a bank too polite to exist anymore. Dear Ms. Ellison, already a strike against the day. My daughter would have liked to sit in your chair. I know you do not draw the dead. That is your rule. Why is it mine? I met the woman at closing because some rules are merciful only if you hold them in your body and not just on your door. She was small in the way grief makes people, spine determined, voice too clear. She carried a paper bag with its handles twisted into a rope by nervous hands. She introduced herself by her first name only. That is the prerogative of the bereaved. They demand nouns we can deliver and deny us the ones we want to hoard. You wrote me, I said. I read it 3 times. I didn't answer because the letter wanted a room. She nodded once, as if she had not prepared herself for kindness. Only a fight. She watched her trial, the mother said, and then flinched, because she had not meant to make a spectacle out of her daughter's habit. She watched the parts they let us watch. She liked the way your face didn't ask to be liked. I don't draw the dead, I said, because a rule is only a kindness if you can stand upright behind it and let it make you sturdy. What do you draw? She asked. The living, I said, which includes mothers. She opened the paper bag and took out a sweatshirt, folded into itself, the kind that holds shape because bodies had trusted it when they were tired. She wore this to everything worth it, she said. Title me with that in the picture. Call me what you like. No, I said. You title you.
Seat.
She did not cry the way television wants. She cried like registers do. Ink pooling in the letter forms, paper accepting, the room acting as a drawer where the subject could be filed and still breathed. I drew her not holding the sweatshirt like a relic, but wearing it around her shoulders like weather, and I let the lines show the way fabric concedes to shoulders that have carried entire families. She titled herself Mother of L. Not the whole name, the initial like the beginning of a prayer, and then put the pencil down and sat still as if she had finally, briefly, been permitted to. After she left, I wrote a policy on the back of the sign in my window. 6. If the dead must be present, they may attend as fabric, as scent, as silence. The drawing will be titled by the living. Dillard came by Wednesday with his students and did a small, pained bow when I told the story. We prefer bones, he said. The world makes us learn fabric. Good. A copycat surfaced online that week. Of course. There is always a boy who watches a trial and misreads the hero. An account with a gallery of silver value graphite overworking the paper tooth. Every clavicle slip with pressure shine like grease. Every title lower left, crystally exact. Every for the record in a borrowed hand. Park brought it to me because our city has a procedure. He tells me when the internet is trying to imitate my worst week, and I tell him whether to laugh or knock on a door. I scrolled. Dillard scrolled over my shoulder and made that small noise teachers make when flattery imitates their curriculum and fails to do it grace. He doesn't love cartilage, he said. He loves audiences. He doesn't know casein, I said. He knows aerosol. He knows loneliness. Park said, not kind, not cruel. We'll knock on a door. We'll give him a list with 2 items and a pen that writes only no.
We did.
The boy cried in an entryway that had never hosted a civil noun. We left with his pencils in a plastic bag and his parents' gratitude like a tax we paid to the weak. I mailed him a copy of the museum's pamphlet with 3 sections highlighted. Hands.
Light. Breath.
I added in my hand, smaller, people. Procedures.
Coffee.
And I put him on a list I was learning how to keep without being its jailer. Living we're keeping with boredom. The last visitor that Friday was Ezra, 19, haircut that pretended not to be deliberate, hoodie that had absorbed more lectures than he had. He hovered in the doorway like a boy in a church he had promised 5 people he would attempt. "The cranes," he said, chin lifting toward the window. My friend folded mine. "I brought one." He held it out, newsprint, smudgy, perfect, and I took it with the solemnity paper deserves when it remembers to become a shape. I hung it on the sash beside the old flock and titled the thread, in pencil, "Donations," because titles are only rude if you force them on faces. He sat and didn't talk for 3 minutes and then did. I drew and didn't talk for 10 and then did. He titled himself Ezra, counting, and texted his mother a photo he would pretend, later, to regret. She texted a heart that would never be admitted into evidence, but would testify if asked. At closing, Nora came by with a clipboard and a smile she keeps for rooms that have learned obedience. "I filed our errata," she said. "No one bit me." "Were you hoping they would?" I asked. "I am learning," she said primly, "to prefer correction to punishment." "Park will be unrecognizable," I said. Park, who had appeared like a piece of furniture locating its room, lifted his coffee and said, "I heard my name the way chairs hear gravity. What are we correcting?" "Our belief that all letters are names," Nora said. "Our conviction that a list is a god." "Good," Park said. "I like rooms that learn to tell the truth out loud." We stood together, 3 people who had carried nouns across a winter, and watched the study lights lower themselves without drama. The USDA dozed. The paper slept. The cranes made a small paper weather. Errata card in the case, lower right, in Nora's hand. We were wrong. We are right now. We left it there so the next person through could decide not to mistake certainty for virtue and procedures for prophecy. Outside, the city had become briefly kind. That, too, went into the register. Chapter 12. Catalog of After. Spring turned into the kind of summer the city uses as a reward for any season you survive, with your hands still gentle. The handbag store on Prentice replaced their decal of a nib with a drawing class schedule that, to my secret satisfaction, used the word cartilage correctly. The private club on Circle stopped hosting salons that drifted toward ritual inflicted on other people and started lending their drawers to the public library once a month. Avril managed the loans and did not speak in paragraphs on any of those nights. Nora kept count and gave him a gold star on a file he will never be permitted to see. Keating put his ledger of paper sales online as a spreadsheet. The first morning he opened it to comments, he had to go lie down with a wet cloth on his vanity, then came back and added a column called Corrections. Lynn's studio underwent its own renovation, not of tile or duct, but of verbs. He hung a sign under the one that lists procedures, small, left justified, not sentimental. Drawings by request/consent on paper/T after. He still drew cartilage like prayer. He did it now with more witnesses, and that turned out to be the sacrament. The trial had torn up a patch of civic ground. The neighborhood paved it with chairs and lights. The museum kept its study center open late on Thursdays for paper hours. Couples came to sit in silence together in a room that smelled like rag and linen. A teenager asked Nora to show him how to place a beanbag weight. He did it wrong on purpose twice, then right as if he had wanted someone to teach him precision all his life, and no one had found the right noun. An old man brought a tin of shortbread and left it on the USDA cart with a note in a hand so careful even a dusting brush would have respected it. For the good machine. We put the cookies under the front desk. We put the note in a sleeve. We gave the sleeve a number. There were people who disliked what we had made of the wreck. They wrote emails protesting the arrogance of rules. They left comments demanding spectacle. They asked, in the soft voice certain industries use when they want your soul one noun at a time, whether we'd consider a show of the original, advanced portraits, as if putting them on the wall would finally make sense of the damage. Nora printed those emails on scratch paper and used the backs to draft policies. Park forwarded the comments to a spam box named in advance and emptied it once a week with a noise that, if you didn't know him, you'd mistake for laughter and, if you did, you recognized as a man encouraging his lungs to remain boring. One evening, when the window light had turned my cranes into currency, I finally sat in my own chair. You cannot run a room like this and never take your turn. You forget, otherwise, that your face is also a noun and not merely an instrument. Lynn came upstairs with his pencils wrapped in their canvas roll like a priest bringing relics. He asked for coffee as if that request was the price of mercy. I made it exactly the way he likes and then ruined it on purpose by adding the smallest spoon of sugar. We are allowed, between friends, to practice forgiveness in the cup. "What title will you take?" he asked, setting his pad on the lip of my table and adjusting the lambent lamp by half a fingerbreadth. He had learned, better than any of us, that light is the first kindness. He had always known it was the last. I had been practicing false answers for 2 months. Forensic artist, too public. Witness, too proud. Subject, too obedient. Alive, too simple. Emmy, the hand I had seen on the lower left of the drawing that nearly took my life and gave me back a rule, too coy. Mara Ellison. I said finally, because objectivity is a word we use to keep ourselves from needing courage. Write it in your hand, in small letters. Lower right, no parentheses. He drew me with the gentleness he uses on fabric and on people who might break if he showed them where their bones sit under their habits. He left my scar under the brow where it lived. He rendered my mouth doing what it does when I am trying not to flatter anyone. Mid-syllable, steady. He drew the cranes in the cornea because to erase them would have been to erase the whole winter. He did not press too hard at the clavicle. You can love someone and keep their vices out of their portrait without losing the truth. When he finished, he put his pencil down with the ceremony he reserves for the small correct acts. "Title," he said, and smiled with the shyness that survived the trial intact. "You gave it to me. Now give it to the paper." I wrote Mara Ellison in a hand tidy enough to satisfy Nora. I added nothing else. No dates. No in advance. No notes to myself about adding a mole or holding breath. We slid it into a sleeve and placed it in the drawer labeled Register of the Living with 1,000 others like it. Students, baristas, a contralto from the community choir, a city council member who insisted on titling herself seat 4, temporary, and then came back 3 months later and crossed out the parentheses with a joke that almost made Nora clap. The next week, Halberd, Lauron, the one allowed to be at parties, came in with a rolled check the length of a short story and the tact to pretend it deserved to be folded in half. He set it on my table and said, "For nothing you were obligated to do with this city, and everything you insisted on. Buy bulbs. Buy beans. Buy chairs that don't punish people for good posture." "I'll buy beanbag weights," I said, "and paper, and boredom." "You'll invoice me," he said, and left as if that sentence relieved him of 2 decades of bad habits. He is a minor villain in a different story and a tolerable ally in this one. That is what it looks like when the city learns. On a humid morning in August, Park stopped at my window and watched a woman sitting for a portrait she was calling not quite ready. He waited while I did the last hatch that gentles the shadow at the corner of a mouth, then nodded at the chair, and I nodded back. He sat on the radiator, like furniture. "They've started bringing me lists," he said. "The good kind. Neighborhood ones." "What's on them?" I asked. "Light bulbs out," he said. "Kids who need someone to teach them how to sit still. Windows that stick. Water pressure. Grievances that can be solved by a wrench. Schedules that do not require arrests." "You like those?" I said. "I prefer them," he said. "I can't prosecute a missing beanbag weight. I can return it to the drawer." We watched the woman sign her title. Underline it once, breathe. "You going to sit?" I asked. He snorted. "You'll have to catch me by accident again," he said, which was as close as he gets to yes. He reached into his pocket and took out a small folded square linen. No tape, only a crease, and handed it to me like a person handing over a found noun. "From Eddie," he said. "He wanted you to have a thing. Says it's for the register." Inside, a scrap of craft, penciled lower left in a hand steady with a night custodian's particular kind of patience. For the register. Under it, smaller bulbs were placed. Chairs tightened. "See you Thursday." I slid it into the case in the study center between the bone folder and the errata card. Nora wrote a number for it and tried not to look pleased. She failed in the way that is really an institution learning to like itself. In September, We took the register of the living out to the library lawn for an afternoon, because rooms can develop a reputation for holiness, and we needed to ruin that gently. We set up under the ginkgo. We taped our sign to the trunk. People sat, then stood, then came back and asked if they could change their titles, and we said yes because that is the only doctrine we keep. Corrections welcome. A kid on a scooter drew his mother drawing him drawing her, which threw the register into a recursion that made Dillard put his hand to his heart and act as if he might fall over with joy. The cranes in my window were replaced by a string of leaves that did their own paperwork, and I let them. Lee's appeal wound its way through filing cabinets. It will end where you expect it to. The DA will climb a microphone. Cameras will pretend to love paper for 6 minutes. Then they will remarry spectacle and leave us for another season. We will be here with beanbag weights and casein, and a jar for pencils labeled sharp/dull/thinking. We will keep drawing people who need the room more than the drawing. We will teach other rooms how to build drawers and agendas that do not kill. We will add an item to the bottom of the pamphlet where the public sees it only after they have forgiven us for rules. 6. When in doubt, chairs, water, windows, lights. On the last warm night before the museum's heating sigh reasserted itself, I stood in the loading dock where everything in this part of the city becomes humble before it is allowed to be admired. Eddie passed with a dolly. He tipped an invisible hat. The air smelled like linen and dust and stories that refused to let themselves be called that. The city hummed its industrial lullaby. I thought of the winter we had just survived. Paper, tape, a list of initials that had tried to make itself a god, and of the register in my drawer with its uneven, beautiful hand where people had written their own names. I took out a card from my pocket, student stock, and wrote a new rule without showing it to anyone first. 7. If someone tries to give you prophecy, offer them a procedure. I taped it under the sign in my window with clear tape, not linen, because prophecy is for saints and I am running a room. Then I unlocked the door the way I always do, twice, because superstition is a kind of grace, and let the first sitter of the morning in. She smelled like cut grass and the end of summer. She looked at the cranes and at the chair and at the pencil in my hand like someone who has decided to forgive the nouns she can't control. What should I be? She asked. Alive, I said. Title it however you like. And we began. Epilogue after the register. Autumn found the cranes faded to the pleasant gray of old paper, which felt right. The room had earned its patina. We had our small religion now, and it refused spectacle. A drawer labeled Register of the Living, a sign that said corrections welcome, a pamphlet that taught strangers how not to bruise a sheet, and a rule in my window that ended arguments before they got theatrical. If someone offers prophecy, give them a procedure. Appeals did their bureaucratic weather. Lee's case inched through its boxes and lost the way men like that lose. On paper, without ceremony. Lemaine learned the etiquette of silence in a program that taught smart people how not to be the loudest thing in the room. Halberd, Lauron, the survivable one, sent money for bulbs and never asked for plaques. Keating put his ledger online and discovered he liked being corrected more than being coy. Averill learned to rap for the public library and let his sentences be short. Lynn stood in doorways and asked permission with his hands before he turned on any light. The Museum Study Center traveled to the branch on Waverly one Saturday a month. Nora supervised with the benevolence of a saint who knows the names of every hinge. The case with the linen tape corners, not for sale, came along like a mascot. Teenagers pawed it with reverence because the label said no, and they wanted very badly to be people who respected no. A grandmother corrected us on a caption and went home pleased that history could be taught to behave. On a wet night, Eddie from facilities turned up in my doorway with a dolly and a grin. Delivery, he said, and set down a flat parcel wrapped with a competence that made the room pay attention. Lower left in pencil, for the register, not record. The cotton tie was tied the way people tie bolins when they've been taught by hands they trusted. Inside, a drawing on decent student stock, nothing fancy, that smelled only of clean graphite and coffee. A woman with an unflinching jaw and a seam on her lip she hadn't asked the world to hide.
Verso sa.
Titled Self. Left when ready.
Ve.
In the corner, almost impish. Coffee excellent. We accessioned a copy for the study and put the original in the drawer with a note. Return to V, upon request. A week later, she came, same jaw, same seam, a little more light around both, and took it in 2 hands without apology. She left ginger cookies on the radiator with a card that said for chairs. I put them where the docents would find them. Good cookies keep rooms civil. Word got around that the chair in my window was a decent place to sit if your nouns needed witnesses. We drew a barber who wanted to be titled practicing patients, a bus driver who chose Route 7, mostly on time, a pastor who wrote learning quiet and meant it. Once, late, Nora sat again and let me draw the new ridge time had set at the corner of her mouth. She titled herself registrar, revised, and then, with a small flourish that would have embarrassed her 6 months ago, added and friend. The only ghost that returned did so properly, postmarked, stamped, signed on the flap. It was a page torn from a ledger, Halberd's grandmother's shop, long ago hats, and in the margin a boy's hand had written in advance and then crossed it out in red. No note, no threat, just an errata in someone else's archives. I slipped it under the museum's errata, reading pressure card, and felt the city adjust its shoulders. On the last warm evening before the radiators remembered their jobs, I took my own turn in the chair again, because rules you won't obey aren't rules, they're posture. Lynn drew me with the same stubborn honesty I try to give strangers. He did not flatter the scar under my brow. He did not punish my mouth for being mid-syllable. He titled the sheet Mara Ellison in letters even Nora would allow herself to like. We slid it into the drawer. The cranes tapped the glass as if to say we had filed the season correctly. After closing, Park stopped by with 2 coffees and an index card. From a block captain, he said. On the card, 7 items in a tidy hand, chairs, water, windows,
Lights. Bulbs.
hinges, names. They're printing our procedures in newsletters now, he added, and his voice did a quiet, private thing it rarely does. It softened. I can handle that kind of fame. We locked up. The streets smelled like leaves and fresh tape. Down the block, the library, lights lowered in polite stages, and somewhere a beginner burned casein and decided never to do that again. We walked to the corner in the ordinary dark of a city that has relearned how to mean well on purpose. At the crosswalk, Park looked up at my window and the small weather of paper boats. Think it'll hold, he asked. It doesn't have to, I said. We do. In the morning, a girl from the bus stop came in with a sketchbook and nerves like glass. She sat and titled herself trying before I'd even sharpened. I taped her word under the window, next to the rule about prophecy. When I looked back, she'd folded me a crane from the sign-off page of her math homework. Perfect creases, crisp beak. It went on the string with the rest. We began.